Just finished getting set up here. I just wanted to chill and watch some YouTube videos, and I haven't streamed in a bit, so I'm gonna stream a little bit of Path of Exile. And what little of this this league is left. Trial of the Ancestors. I haven't even played any of the league mechanic yet. I have no idea how it's gonna go. And yeah, I don't really watch anyone else play Path of Exile, so I'll find out. And yeah, this is a pretty much improvisational. I'm just not following any guides. I'm just playing for fun and until I hit a wall, and then I'll stop playing. Hopefully I can get a little bit further this time than last league. Or last league I got the farthest, but not satisfactory enough for me. But I'm gonna take a kind of a backseat, and I'm gonna watch videos from Never Knows Best. I'm gonna watch one of his videos on Final Fantasy 14, his analysis, and then I'll probably go into his the history of MMO videos. So he has very good content, man. It's amazing how well documented it is and how informative it is. And yeah, it's basically like a history lesson, and it's crazy how like it's on the YouTube platform for now, but like in like many decades time, right? They will look back at this video archive, and they'll see like there is no other video game historian that documents it to this level. Like to this level of connected realism. So I'm gonna watch it and enjoy it while I can. So let me put it up in momentarily. I'm trying to think if I should do it full screen or not. I'll probably just do it on a window truncated thing on the side, and I'll just leave it on I think I'll just leave it on the side instead of like front and center. So I'll leave the game and Path of Exile on here, and then I'll put a video player right here. I could move it a little bit further down, just like a little bit down there, maybe. A little bit of room for that.
Earlier this year, it was reported that World of Warcraft was no longer the most actively played MMO in the world, having been surpassed for the first time in its long 18-year history. The game, which accomplished this impressive feat, originally launched to critical disdain and a lowly Metacritic score of just 49 when it first released in 2010. And yet, its latest expansion has the highest user score of any game released in 2021, and it currently has over twice the number of active players of World of Warcraft and World of Warcraft Classic combined. The tale of Final Fantasy XIV might be the greatest comeback a video game has ever made, and its rise over the last 12 months is a genuine piece of MMO history. It is the first time since its release in late 2004 that World of Warcraft has not sat atop the MMO world looking down at its lesser peers. It is the first time it's ever had to look up. But this video isn't about World of Warcraft, and unlike a lot of people who have been talking about Final Fantasy XIV this past year, I am not a WoW refugee, only now seeking asylum in the greener pastures of Eorzea. In fact, I am pretty close to a Final Fantasy XIV veteran, as although I didn't play the largely unsuccessful and later abandoned 1.0 version of the game, I have been playing the Realm Reborn version on and off since not long after its release in 2013. In total, I have over 6,200 hours playtime, which is around 260 days of logged in game time, meaning Final Fantasy XIV is my most played game of all time, probably by a few thousand hours. I've also played nearly every mainline Final Fantasy game, including some of 14's predecessor, Final Fantasy XI, as well as many other big-name MMOs released in the last 15 years. Suffice it to say, this is a game which I have a lot of opinions about, but beyond that, it's also a game I believe is worth talking about, and a game of some significance within the industry.
Good day.
In a time when the entire MMO genre has seemed to be suffering a slow, agonizing death of new disappointments and old disillusionments, Final Fantasy XIV is one of the only overwhelmingly positive success stories. It might be the only MMO released since World of Warcraft which has been able to consistently grow its player base year on year, rather than just stem the flow of players leaving after an overinflated launch. And right now, its biggest problem is the kind other games can only dream of having, which is that there are actually too many players. Since the release of the latest expansion, Endwalker, every server has been at max capacity for most of the day, leading to queues of up to 5 to 6 hours just to log in during evenings and weekends in the first couple of weeks. And the recent popularity has become so much of a problem that Square Enix has had to suspend all sales of the game.
I remember
until
that.
recently, those queues of 5 to 6 hours.
I think that
would
was
also
when
give you
I
errors,
tried
forcing
to
you have
start
to
playing
re-queue multiple
and
times.
decided
Enjoy.
it was not for me
On the
when they
day
did that.
Endwalker released, I was there at 9 AM when the servers came back online, but after queuing up once and then soon getting kicked from the game, I had to re-queue multiple times and didn't actually get to play until just before midnight.
I really
almost
almost started
13
playing it,
hours later.
but not anymore.
That day, I may have been unlucky, but I've still never seen a queue situation quite this bad in any game before, and this problem, while no longer quite so bad, is still ongoing and affecting everyone. And yet, despite that, Endwalker still has the highest Metacritic user score of the year. Hours and hours, day after day, of people not being able to play a game they are paying a monthly subscription for, and the player base is still pretty overwhelmingly happy. Which begs the question of how has this happened? How has Final Fantasy XIV become so beloved? How has this game done what no other MMO could? And what does this mean for the genre? And with over 6,000 hours of game time, I feel I am in a position to at least try to answer those questions. Before that though, a quick thank you to this video's sponsor, Manscaped.
I'm gonna try it over here.
Now, if there's one thing everyone knows about MMO players, it's that they're a very well-groomed group of people. That's what they say. Wow, MMO players, how well-groomed you all are. And there's no better around to help you maintain that esteemed status than Manscaped, the global leader in men's grooming and hygiene products like the Lawnmower 4.0, which provides precision grooming for even the most sensitive of areas. And with its skin-safe technology, waterproof design, LED spotlight,
the video is
and
about a year
wireless
old
charging,
though. It's not very
basically
recent,
idiot-proof,
but
which, based on many of the people I've played with, is also probably a good thing for MMO players. And you can get all that alongside Manscaped's anti-chafing ball deodorant, ball spray toner, handy disposable magic mat, and 2 free gifts, all with 20% off and free international shipping when you use code NKB at checkout.
Go back to Cobra Lash.
So follow the link below, and thank you Manscaped for helping keep the lights on at the Never Knows Best YouTube channel. There is one final thing to talk about before we truly begin, and that is a little bit about the genre itself. There is no feasible way to tell the entire history of the MMO genre in a couple paragraphs, so I won't. But if you were to skip over almost everything and still wanted to understand what the hell's been going on with the genre for the past couple decades, then I think it's best to think of it like this. You can divide MMO history up into 2 parts, the old school era and the modern era, with one game sitting in the middle as a bridge between the two and as a landmark everyone recognises. That game is World of Warcraft, and when it was released in 2004, it was noteworthy for being more accessible, less grindy, less punishing, and with a more engaging quest design than the MMOs of the past which preceded it. If you were to compare that 2004 vanilla World of Warcraft to modern World of Warcraft or any other modern MMOs, those descriptions wouldn't make much sense anymore, because compared to most MMOs that came since, including the game that WoW has become, vanilla WoW was decidedly old school in its design. And that's why it's helpful to think of MMOs in 2 eras, with World of Warcraft being the changing point when the genre started taking major steps towards accessibility and player convenience in the way these games were fundamentally designed. Some examples include the introduction of Dungeon Finder, raids of multiple difficulties including Looking for Raid, the widespread use of plugins and ubiquity of DPS meters, cross-server grouping and sharding or mega servers, more focus on instanced PvP rather than open-world PvP, and so on. Other changes came about not through the actions of developers, but just as a result of the evolution of the internet age, like the widespread use of guides for raid content, or wikis to tell you where quest objectives were, or optimally calculated DPS rotations to tell you exactly how best to play your class, or streamers existing. The main consequences of this were a rapid increase in accessibility and convenience, but as these increased, the importance of community decreased alongside them, as new game features and the internet replaced the need to talk to and interact with other players. For example, to find a group for a dungeon, you used to have to shout in chat to recruit and manually invite people, then all travel together to the dungeon while watching out for being attacked by members of the opposing faction. Then they added the dungeon finder, and all you do is click to queue up, wait for the queue to pop, and then click to teleport straight inside. Hopefully, you can see the difference between these two experiences. One is simple and convenient, the other is not, but it does encourage socializing, as not only do you have to talk to people to get anywhere, you also have an incentive to befriend those you meet to make the process of finding a group easier in the future. What you really need to understand here though, is that this kind of fundamental change wasn't limited to a few one-off examples. It was widespread and existential in nature. It was like the Industrial Revolution had come for the MMO genre, where the old ways of doing things were replaced by this new, more efficient machinery of the modern age, and you had to get with the times or be left behind. And while many people, myself included, still remember and might have a preference towards how things were in the past, it doesn't change the fact that MMOs changed, and World of Warcraft led the way. Then, along comes Final Fantasy XIV, which was originally released in 2010 and was nothing like World of Warcraft. Instead, it was a spiritual successor to Square's earlier MMO, the more old school yet also quite console focused Final Fantasy XI, but this version of Final Fantasy XIV proved unsuccessful with critics and fans alike, mostly because of its outdated design features. So, a couple years later, it was shut down, only to be rebooted in 2013 as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Many details were kept, like the setting and races, but many things changed, as this time, instead of being inspired by Final Fantasy XI, the developers instead took inspiration from the king of modern MMOs, World of Warcraft. And that's not just conjecture on my part, there are quotes from reliable sources confirming as much. They make it sound like WoW became their holy bible in learning how to design a modern MMO. And so, the Final Fantasy XIV of today is a modern World of Warcraft inspired MMO through and through. But unlike World of Warcraft, which changed heavily along the way, this version of Final Fantasy XIV was built from the ground up with modernity in mind, and accessibility and convenience became a part of its DNA. This makes comparisons between these two games fairly sensible, as there are many ways the games are similar, but it's also worth remembering that Final Fantasy XIV is by no means the only game inspired by World of Warcraft. In fact, in the years which followed its initial ground-shattering success, there were several high-profile WoW clones, which at the time were sometimes ambitiously referred to as WoW killers, but none of them achieved their desired regicide, and the other MMOs which have went on to be successful over the last decade have tended to be those that are less inspired by World of Warcraft, like Guild Wars 2, The Elder Scrolls Online, Black Desert, and the still surprisingly relevant RuneScape. And by the way, that is basically every moderately sized MMO in existence right now. This genre is not as crowded as it once was, and the days when MMOs were seen as the future of gaming and were being compared to hardcore drugs on national television for the threat they posed to the youth of today are long past. In fact, the last decade has not been kind to the MMO genre, with success stories being few and far between. There was once hope for a new wave of Kickstarter MMOs, but it's now almost 10 years later and most either still haven't released yet, or should just never have released in the first place. Generally, things are bleak for MMO fans, which makes Final Fantasy XIV all the more significant. It has succeeded where others have failed, grown at a time when the genre has seemed to be shrinking, and overtaken that which for a long time was seen as untouchable. So, why? What exactly has this game done right? What sets it apart from its less successful peers? Well, let me tell you exactly why, in 5 parts, spread out across 2 hours, and delivered alongside some healthy criticism of the game in its current state, and other observations about what the game does well. Hey, I give you answers to questions people may or may not care about on this channel. I don't make those answers easy. So, let us begin. Every experienced MMO player knows that the early hours of these games are rarely the best, and Final Fantasy XIV is no exception. Still, compared to some games in the genre, Final Fantasy XIV is fairly easy to get into, although that might depend on where exactly you're trying to enter it from. Once you get past the minor annoyance of having to make a Square Enix account, you then create your player character, in a character creation that is overall good, but has some clear room for improvement. 4 faces per race and gender isn't really enough, particularly when some of them look like this, and who decided beard options should be face specific? That's not how beards are meant to work. Still, for most things there are plenty of options, and it's easy to make good looking characters at least. And with that done, your adventure begins. From here your experience will vary greatly depending on whether you're familiar with MMOs or not. Really, you could categorize all Final Fantasy XIV players into 3 not mutually exclusive groups. You have MMO fans here to try out a new MMO, Final Fantasy fans here to try out a new Final Fantasy, and fans of games with good stories here because someone told them this game has a good story and probably then continually pressured them to give it a go until one day they finally relented, even if just to shut them up. And, for the most part, this is a game that has been designed to appeal to all 3 of these groups, but which you're in might heavily impact your initial impressions, so why not consider each in turn? For those only here for the story, you're in luck, both in regards to how much story there is and how soon it gets underway, with the player taking the role of a new adventurer freshly arrived in one of the 3 different city-states of Eorzea. From here, the story goes on to place a large focus on world building, introducing you to the state of affairs within your initial surroundings, then the rest of Eorzea, before the primary focus settles on the beast tribes of the land and their tendency to summon powerful magic creatures known as primals, who they worship as gods, and who the player tends to get tasked with taking care of. This is a big part of what you do in this game initially. You go around killing other people's summoned gods, which is not a bad way for an MMO story to create a near endless supply of raid bosses. Things are further complicated though by a new attack from the hostile Garlean Empire, who deem the presence of primals popping up in Eorzea as a threat, and by a mysterious group of robed figures known as Ascians, as well as many other things, one of which being that 5 years before A Realm Reborn begins, there was something called the Calamity, where a Garlean general brought down the moon, which was actually hiding an ancient Allagan prison containing the elder primal Bahamut within it, who then unleashed devastation on the land, almost destroying everything, including, maybe, you. This is what you see in the opening cinematic, and it's also the way Final Fantasy 1.0, the unsuccessful version of the game released in 2010, ended in late 2012. Yeah, the reboot of the game was an event written into the lore, and something legacy players actually got to play through over the course of several months. Oh, this is actually the 7th Calamity, and you can hear about the rest, and many of their accompanying civilizations, as you play through the game, alongside all sorts of other things. There are many ways you can describe the story of Final Fantasy XIV, and complicated might be one of the most obvious. There is a lot of lore and world building, and most of it is delivered by way of dialogue in the main story and side quests. This results in a very text-heavy, story-driven game, and it's hard to imagine many people will really enjoy the overall experience if they're not prepared to at least take the time needed to read through the main questline. And if you do read through this questline, it will eventually take you to the stars and beyond, in a journey of such extravagant scale, depth, and emotion that the only word to truly describe it is epic. But that's not quite what you get in the early game. Final Fantasy XIV's story is slow, its beginnings are humble, and compared to most other non-MMOs, its presentation can seem a little lacking. This is something which has improved over time, with each expansion receiving more voice acting and higher quality cutscenes, but even now there's still a heavy reliance on recycled animations, particularly with the player's own character, who is mostly limited to in-game emotes as a means of expressing themselves within the narrative. The Realm Reborn section of the game is even more behind the times though. Even the opening cutscene is only partly voice acted, and from then on, voice acting is infrequent, with even the relatively high effort climax of A Realm Reborn, the Praetorium, still only getting voice acting for the final battle with Gaius. As for the quality of the voice acting, it's not great, as while some characters are fine, many feel a bit amateur, and when you get to the game's first expansion, Heavensward, the entire English voice acting cast just gets replaced. From here, the quality drastically increases, but the sudden change is jarring, particularly for new players who go straight from A Realm Reborn to Heavensward without the several-month break in between past players experienced at the time. For any who have forgotten just how jarring this change is, here are a few examples to refresh your memory.
Well, far be it from me to boast, but I do have the ear of certain influential individuals. More than generous, my friend.
On behalf of my fellows, I humbly accept your offer of hospitality.
We both know I can do no such thing. It isn't safe for you here alone.
If we sever these supply lines, we should at least be able to slow the escalation.
And in addition to the speed and manner in which it's told, the story in A Realm Reborn also isn't Final Fantasy XIV's strongest. The robed Ascians who play the role of shadowy puppet masters come across as hammy and uninteresting. The Garleans have some cool armour, but otherwise seem like your typical generic militaristic empire, and the main characters who support the player in your adventure, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, feel flat and underdeveloped. So, if you're only here for the story, A Realm Reborn doesn't show the game at its best, but it does provide an introduction to this world, and it's a world worthy of introducing. Say what you like about the base game, but you can't deny that its world has a certain free-spirited, high-fantasy, classic JRPG charm to it, particularly if you're a Final Fantasy fan, and here we come to the second type of player. If you are a fan of the series, 14 goes to great lengths to serve you with plentiful references that span the entire main series and start immediately, and for the most part they are done quite tastefully. There are some exceptions. For example, I have long hated the veteran reward outfits of classic Final Fantasy protagonists, and the fact that the Cloud outfit is from the movie, not the game, doesn't exactly help matters. If this was a single player game, this wouldn't be a problem as you could just ignore them, but I resent seeing these outfits around the world. It detracts from immersion and feels like a cheap and lazy way to implement fan service. But most examples aren't like this. I still think Final Fantasy XIV occasionally tries too hard with its fan service, and there's a fine line between an enjoyable reference and something that just feels forced. To show what I mean, just look at the previous two 8-man raids, Eden and Omega. During the Omega raid, the entity that is Omega basically creates replications of powerful foes to test the player, and the foes it creates just happen to be 4 bosses from Final Fantasy V and then 4 from Final Fantasy VI. The problem with this is that it comes across as overly deliberate, and for anyone who isn't familiar with these games, these bosses seem disconnected and uninteresting in their own right. I mean, I remember Sabin suplexing the Phantom Train just like everyone else, but fighting a train as the first boss in Sigmascape is just weird for anyone who hasn't played the original game. Meanwhile, the next raid, Eden,
I didn't know that was
is
a thing.
full of Final Fantasy VIII
They did a
references,
callback
but they're
to
handled more subtly, and the
Final
overarching
Fantasy VI,
story
yeah.
is designed to be enjoyable on its own. So in Eden, the references
Yo, we
enhance
might-
something which would otherwise still work without them, whereas Deltascape
It might
and
be
Sigmascape
feasible
rely
to get
on
an
familiarity with the source
FF6
material for
remake
their appeal, and the former is
future.
better in my opinion.
or not feasible.
For
I
the
mean,
most
it might
part,
be
though, Final
possible.
Fantasy
It's
fans
been
are in for a
discussed
treat
about
with 14,
before.
and even
by
though this
the
side of
Square
Final
Enix
Fantasy
heads.
14 isn't really what makes it good, and its original concepts and designs have always been on par with any of those taken from the rest of the series, there is something to seeing so many references from material many players will be familiar and fond of. In a way, this game can seem like a celebration of the entire Final Fantasy series, and even as someone who usually doesn't care much for fan service, I'd be lying if I didn't admit that as a big Final Fantasy VII fan, when Knights of the Round showed up in Heavensward, it was incredible. It was both so unexpected and yet fit the story so perfectly, and it remains one of my favourite moments in the entire game. However, even the biggest Final Fantasy fans, as well as anyone just here for the story, will eventually have to come to terms with the fact that Final Fantasy or not, this is still an MMO. If you've never played an MMO before, it's a genre that can be a bit intimidating. For starters, the amount of systems and UI elements players soon get introduced to might seem overwhelming, but compared to some games in the genre, the default UI doesn't look too bad here, and while the onslaught of tutorial pop-ups is initially rather off-putting, at least there is lots of information in-game to teach new players, including what to do in group settings. Players will also need to get used to combat, which might not be what most are familiar with. Final Fantasy XIV has tab targeting combat, which is something with a long pedigree of MMO tradition, which basically means most people these days might consider it outdated. At a basic level, it works by manually targeting enemies and then using abilities that are assigned to your hotbar. The higher level your character gets, the more abilities they accumulate, leading to complicated rotations of combos, reactive skills, offensive and defensive cooldowns, and so on. Originally, tab target combat became the system of choice for MMOs due to netcode limitations for early games in the genre, but these days its main advantages are accessibility and, eventually, depth. The downside is that it's not very dynamic or impactful, as the player plays little role in aiming or executing their attacks, because as long as your foe is targeted and you happen to be in range, everything is just a single button press. In some ways, it can feel a little like you're giving orders to a character rather than being the one actually controlling them yourself, as the mechanical execution for every ability is the same, and I imagine the younger generations have a strong preference for true action combat systems, as they feel more exciting. Still, while it might not be as engaging as some of its alternatives, it is easy to pick up, and neither JRPGs nor Final Fantasy games are exactly known for their great early game gameplay anyway. The other thing new players will need to get used to is that as this is an MMO, it means at some point you will need to play with other people. I know, other people? How disgusting. Who would want to play with them? Well, don't worry, my antisocial friend. Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most solo-friendly MMOs you'll ever find. You can even do most group content with NPCs instead of players, and gone are the days of actually needing to talk to people to get anywhere in MMOs anyway. You do have to group up with people to complete dungeons and trials sometimes, and you do need to complete many dungeons and trials as part of the story, but the process is effortless thanks to an easy-to-use automatic group finder. The skill requirements are always rather low to avoid excluding anyone, and the people you'll meet are probably pretty quiet. It's rare to see more than the odd hello and thanks for the group in most group settings, and there's certainly no need to socialise. Just ignore the people you see around the main square of Limsa Laminsa.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
And if you do find yourself talking to another person, you'll probably find them reasonably helpful, which is partly a result of the Sprout icon all new players get branded with. This might sound more like a curse than a blessing, particularly if you have any preconceived notions about MMO player elitism, or you just really hate small plants. But the reality is, people tend to be very forgiving and understanding of new players, and with a Sprout icon above your head, you don't even need to say anything for everyone to realise this is what you are. And there are other ways this game incentivizes positive interactions with others as well, like the commendation system used to reward players in group settings, or the first time completion bonus, ensuring new players in most groups are usually more of a boon than burden. So, for new players who lack MMO experience, Final Fantasy XIV offers something that is, relatively speaking, very easy to get into, and waste no time showing off its Final Fantasy theming and throwing you into its long and, these days, highly acclaimed story. The generous free trial also allows players to try all of the base game and first expansion without spending any money, and as monthly subscriptions are generally considered rather off-putting to non-MMO players, this also probably helps convince new people to give the game a chance. That's not to say that MMOs, Final Fantasy or otherwise, are a type of game that will be for everyone, and aspects like the tab targeting combat, the UI design, the infrequent voice acting, and so on might still turn new players away, but Final Fantasy XIV has clearly been designed to ease new players into the experience, and the strong branding the Final Fantasy name gives it, and the lack of MMO competition these days, have likely helped ensure that there is a constant influx of new players willing to try the game out for themselves.
Exile.
This is the first, albeit least interesting reason, for why I think this game has been so successful. it is an accessible, relatively polished, and new player-friendly MMO with a strong reputation in a time when competition is fairly scarce. And while this doesn't provide the most exciting way to kick our list of reasons off, sometimes life isn't always about the most exciting ways. That's just how it is. There is still one last group of players worth considering here though, and that is those who are already experienced with MMOs. This group won't have a unified set of expectations, but most will still be judging the game on how it compares to other MMOs. So, how does the early Final Fantasy XIV experience compare to its peers? Well, firstly, as already mentioned, it is more story focused. This is particularly true now the rate of experience point gain has been increased, meaning you can level almost the entire way by just following the main story quest. But even before this, Final Fantasy XIV was always very story heavy by MMO standards. This also impacts the leveling experience, as there's less focus on doing tasks within the game world, but MMOs don't always have the best reputation when it comes to giving players fun tasks to do within their worlds. As for the world itself, it does look good, particularly for a game released in 2013, but the main downside to this is frequent loading screens separating areas. This game was originally designed to run on the PlayStation 3's very limited amount of RAM, and while PS3 support has luckily been abandoned since Stormblood, certain scars still show, like the way that the 3 original cities are each split into 2 distinct areas. As for new zones, while they might have continued the trend of looking good and have grown larger in size, in other ways even less care has been placed on world design. In the Realm Reborn zones there is a lot of variety to enemies, with both non-hostile foes and the occasional higher level enemy, as well as more consideration placed on enemy layout, or making sure enemies feel like a part of an actual ecosystem. In later zones however, all enemies feel overly similar in strength and behaviour, and their layout seems very evenly spaced, with little consideration given to realism. And this lack of attention to detail might be a little disappointing for anyone coming from an MMO which places more focus on the world itself. As for the combat, tab targeting will likely be nothing new, but something you will hear a lot, particularly from World of Warcraft players, are concerns over the global cooldown, or GCD. This is the time between each use of a normal ability. The standard GCD in Final Fantasy XIV is 2.5 seconds, which is slower than WoW's 1.5, and for years this has been a widely referenced data point when making comparisons between the two games, with the 2.5 GCD of Final Fantasy being used as proof that the combat is slow and therefore bad. And at low levels, when your character only has access to a small portion of their overall skill set, the difference in speed is very noticeable. However, by max level, the difference in combat speed is less apparent, and the 2.5 second GCD of Final Fantasy can be quite misleading. Firstly, it can be lowered by the stats skill speed, as well as other class-specific buffs. For example, on Monk, one of the faster melee classes, I currently have a base GCD of 1.87 seconds, which isn't really that far off the 1.5 of WoW. Secondly, Final Fantasy features many instant abilities, which are not on the global cooldown and can instead be interwoven between two GCDs, making combat feel faster than the GCD implies. For example, here is the current opener for Dragoon, one of the melee classes with the slowest GCD. In the image, the GCDs are on the bottom row, and as you can see, not only are there lots of additional off-GCD abilities, but you also need to sometimes press 2 off-GCD abilities between each GCD. So the difference in combat speed is smaller than the GCD makes it seem, and comparisons between actions per minute for each game shows that they are quite similar. WoW is still overall slightly faster, but Final Fantasy also tends to have slightly longer rotations to make up for this. There is still a slightly different feel to combat though, with WoW's rotations seeming more frenetic thanks in large part to the heavy reliance on procs or reactive abilities, whereas Final Fantasy's rotations feel more methodical due to their more static and deterministic nature, but in terms of both speed, complexity and overall skill required to perform, I have always found the two games not really that dissimilar. But Final Fantasy can feel slow at the start, particularly if you have spent lots of hours playing an MMO with a faster GCD. A bigger and yet less talked about combat difference between these two games is when abilities actually trigger. Final Fantasy XIV features many high quality combat animations, which are very pleasing on the eye, although they can also be overly flashy in group encounters. Because of this, there is an option in the settings to reduce other players' battle effects, which I highly recommend you turn down, as while 4-man content might look okay, 8-man content becomes messy, and 24-man content or highly populated open world events like Fates or Hunts feature so many particle effects and flashing
that's
lights.
a big ass
that it can feel like a
cluttered
war crime is
mess.
being
That's
committed
really
against
hard to
your eyes
read.
each time you have the pleasure of grouping up.
Holy crap, that
Still, while
UI.
Final Fantasy XIV's flashy combat animations are usually a positive, these animations aren't always that responsive. If you press an ability in WoW, it feels like it happens instantly, with the damage number and sound effect triggering straight away.
That's all
But if you press an
localized.
ability in Final Fantasy, it often feels like there is a small delay to account for the animation.
I don't know.
and
I don't
even
know
instant
if they handle it
effects can feel
server
like they
side or
take
local.
time to trigger. Something you can easily notice on abilities which lock you in place for their duration, like Dragoon's Jump. There's also possible differences in netcode and recognition of abilities server-side. This is hard to compare between games, and I've seen a lot of contradictory information about this from players over the years, but any experienced Final Fantasy XIV player can surely remember times when you use your instant "oh shit" ability, like Benediction, Hallowed Ground, Home Gang, or Living Dead, only for it to go on cooldown without actually triggering in time. This is annoying
Oh,
and
that's
potentially very costly,
enraging.
and that kind of thing doesn't seem to happen in WoW because WoW's combat is very responsive. It is one of the best things about
So
it.
you can pop a
Finally, there's also
cooldown
a difference
and
in
still
enemy ability
die
timings that many new players will find
because
strange
you didn't
until
queue
they're
it
used
up
to
and buffer it early
which is that
enough
these abilities trigger
because of
instantly based
the
on when
the delay
enemy
in the
finishes their
response.
cast. However, this is also when the animation for these abilities starts, and animations always take some time to play out, meaning the animations are somewhat delayed from when the attack effect actually happens. What this essentially means is that if you are just inside an enemy AoE when the cast ends, then you'll always be hit by that AoE, even if you move out of it by the time you actually see the animation. And the reverse is also true, meaning as long as you are outside the AoE when the cast ends, you can move back into the AoE area straight away without being hit as the animation plays.
Ooh,
This is at least a fair and easy to understand
that's
way
a
for
big
enemy abilities
problem,
to
man.
work, but it's not
How-
intuitive.
imagine
for
if
new
Neo
players,
2 did
and
that.
it can look and feel
Well, actually, Neo
very
2 kind
unnatural.
of did do that for
There are
Tsuchigumo.
plenty of other differences between Final Fantasy XIV and other MMOs too, in aesthetics and content, in the class system and character building, in party size and etiquette, and so on. Some of these differences I'll come back to, but I think it's the two previously mentioned that are the most notable for MMO fans, which are that Final Fantasy XIV's combat starts slow and can take time to get used to, and that this is a very story-focused game with more emphasis placed on storytelling than other potentially important aspects like world design. And so, for all three different types of potential new player, we can see that there's always one thing tying everyone's different experiences together, one thing you can't escape in this game, no matter who you are or what you enjoy, and that is the importance of the main story. This is an MMO, maybe the only MMO, where story truly takes precedence over everything else, and so I guess it's only fair to talk more about that story before anything else.
Damn. Super informative so far. I don't feel like I need to play the game now.
MMOs are unique because, unlike other games, in MMOs you are not the main character. Instead, you're just one of many players who have to work together in this collective world, all sharing the spotlight. But someone might have forgotten to tell that to Final Fantasy XIV. Because here, you are not just the main character. You are the most main character who has ever main charactered a video game, and that's not an
I get it.
exaggeration. You are the Warrior of Light, hero of Eorzea, Blessed of Hydaelyn, ender of the Dragonsong War, liberator of Alamigo and the Eastern Front, and vanquisher of countless Primals, Garleans, Ascians, and anything else stupid enough to get in your way. You are beloved, respected, worshipped, and praised by all, and you kind of deserve it. Here, everyone is your simp. If you look up the word hero in an Eorzean dictionary, you will find a small picture of yourself. And every NPC you've never talked to dreams of the day they get to share a cutscene, just one, not even voice-acted cutscene, with you, the Warrior of Light. And, as for all these other people you see running around, dancing in the main square of Limsa, sitting in the housing districts crafting potions, camping out rare spawning fates for just 15 more minutes, who are they? Who cares? Compared to you,
No, so you're the singular
warrior of
character
light,
and
they're
all.
not to their strengths, and that includes in how they tell their stories. MMOs are unique because of the other people you share the world with, and it therefore stands to reason that the best MMO stories should incorporate this aspect into their narrative to tell a story only games of this genre can. Most modern MMOs don't do this, however, maybe because creating a narrative without a defined main character for events to revolve around is challenging, and Final Fantasy XIV proves it's not really necessary either. An MMO can work with a single player style story, and while that might be a little disappointing from a theoretical standpoint, it's hard to argue with results. There are some major caveats to any praise given to this game's narrative, however, the first of which has already been mentioned. When A Realm Reborn first released, reviews actually tended to be very positive about its story, but compared to each expansion released since, the difference in quality feels clear, in storytelling, writing, and originality. But A Realm Reborn does lay an important foundation, which each subsequent expansion has built upon. The first, Heavensward, makes for the most noticeable jump in quality. Where A Realm Reborn's primary focus is on world building, and its action is split between various primal-obsessed beast tribes, ongoing Eorzean politics, and the latest Garlean invasion, Heavensward is instead more focused, telling the story of the isolationist city-state Ishgard and its 1,000-year conflict, the Dragon's Song War. You begin by leaving the base game behind, literally and metaphorically, as you're forced to take refuge in Ishgard, before setting off on a journey through the surrounding lands to discover the truth of the long war's history, while accompanied by a small group of relevant characters who each provide a different perspective on events. In this way, Heavensward feels like a classic JRPG tale of a band of adventurers coming together to travel through fantastical lands to try to eventually save the day. And whereas A Realm Reborn featured many characters, none of which received any real development, Heavensward is where that starts to change. This is most notable with Alphinaud, who is almost unbearable in A Realm Reborn. If you haven't played through this section in a while, you may have forgotten this, but from the low quality voice acting, to his know-it-all personality, to his young age and Mary Sue-like status, he really comes across as annoying and unlikable. And it almost feels like the writers realised this, because between A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, some major things go wrong for him, leaving him greatly humbled. In Heavensward, we then see him have moments of self-reflection, through which he has a chance to grow and mature, and suddenly his self-importance and idealism is tempered against his newfound sense of perspective, and he actually becomes quite likeable. Heavensward is also where these supporting characters first start to feel like your friends. There's a moment early on I've always liked where Tartaro and Alphinaud are accused of heresy and demand a trial by combat. Except Tartaro has no combat experience, so she calls on you to be her champion, and it feels good to stand up for someone who you know has been wrongly accused. Games always act like everyone is best friends with the main character, but it's moments like this which actually allow you to feel that friendship, and it makes sense that the struggle the main cast of Heavensward go through would ultimately bring them together. Most of these positive trends continue with each later expansion. Stormblood is the black sheep of the post-Realm Reborn family, but its story is still a lot stronger than the base game. It continues the overarching plot of the Garlean Empire, as the player seeks to liberate the city-states of Alamigo and Doma from Garlean control. The way the narrative is split between these two distinct and far-apart fronts leaves the story feeling slightly fractured. Its depictions of war never truly manage to live up to the grand scale an event like this should have, and Stormblood's attempt to focus on a single important character, Lys, feels like a less successful repeat attempt of what Heavensward did with Alphinaud. But in other ways, the story has plenty of fun moments, and its relatively simple and action-driven nature makes for a nice change of pace from the frequently exposition-heavy and sometimes convoluted story elements seen in so much of the rest of the game. It might be the weakest overall expansion in terms of narrative, but it's had some strong competition. Speaking of which, the next expansion, the fan favourite Shadowbringers, has the player journey to an entirely new dimension which is being drowned by light. This forces the main character to take up the role of Warrior of Darkness in a subversion that feels instantly engaging and also gives Shadowbringers a really strong aesthetic identity that comes across as wholly distinct from anything else in the Final Fantasy series. Initially, I was turned off by Shadowbringers' seemingly unnecessary isekai-like premise of being teleported to another world, but by the time the journey is coming to its close, it's almost impossible not to be won over by certain aspects of the tale it tells. Still, the single greatest achievement of Shadowbringers is how it took the worst part of Final Fantasy XIV's story, the ever-present, over-the-top and always annoying shadowy-robed Ascians, and fleshes out their backstory to humanize the group and give them clear and understandable motivations, which instantly makes every part of Final Fantasy XIV's greater narrative better as a result. Finally, there is Endwalker, which provides an apocalyptic finale to the entire overarching story the rest of the game has been
Never
telling,
heard of Endwalker.
and it is stunning in its grandeur, ambition, and sheer unexpectedness. As it's still relatively close to release and the events of Endwalker carry such significance, I'll avoid talking about them in detail to avoid spoilers, but I will say that the trailer for Endwalker shows the player's character going to the moon, a feat with some tradition in the Final Fantasy series. But while you might expect something like this to be the finale of Endwalker, it is not. It isn't even close. You are going to places and defeating enemies that you would expect to be a normal game's final boss before you even make it to the expansion's halfway point, and then it just keeps going to more places and greater things that no one would have predicted. And when the ending finally does come, it is truly special. That's not to say that everything about this story necessarily works, but at the same time I can think of few things in gaming quite like it. There are problems with Final Fantasy XIV's story and the way the game chooses to tell it, but I do think it needs to be stressed that while this story does have its lows, its highs are also some of the highest you will ever see in a video game, and it provides a journey like few others. Still, about those problems. You know, call me old-fashioned here, but one thing I do value in a video game is feeling like I am actually playing it. And there are long stretches in Final Fantasy XIV where that feeling is lost, because while the narrative quality might have increased over time,
Have you played Metal Gear Solid
interactivity
games?
has decreased, and it wasn't that great to begin with. So much of this game is spent watching cutscenes or reading dialogue, and outside of the occasional dungeon, trial,
He's
or
played Metal
sequence
Gear.
or
I
set piece,
don't doubt
there
it.
just
He's
isn't
played everything
any
I played,
meaningful gameplay.
probably.
And no,
And more
going
of
into
it.
an ominously glowing circle to kill a couple enemies that spawn in is not meaningful gameplay, but often you don't even get that. Every quest just contains so much writing, which is fine when the events the writing is covering feel important enough to justify this, but even when the main story slows down and sends you on relatively unimportant errands for a while, the density of dialogue just
Well,
continues.
they had to go through the
In
the
end,
writer's
this can be
strike also,
exhausting,
didn't they?
even if you enjoy the story.
It wasn't just the
And
movie
throughout the last
industry.
two
The writer's
expansions,
strike
I found
affected
myself
games
always longing
also.
to get to the next dungeon or trial, just to get a brief moment of respite where I could feel like I was actually playing the game again. The irony is that while A Realm Reborn has the weakest story by far, in other ways it also had the best questing experience, as you were regularly sent out into the world to fulfill some objective, which afforded the player small breaks from the constant barrage of text boxes. But Heaven's Ward
Barrage.
started the trend of more story and less gameplay, and then Shadowbringers ramped this up several degrees further to the point where the gameplay is barely there anymore, and then Endwalker goes even further. And the few new attempts at gameplay-focused quests, like the sections where you target something with a crosshair, or Endwalker's new trend of following missions, have largely been unsuccessful. Killing enemies and finding objectives in the game world isn't great, but it's better than this, and at least it can be used to highlight interesting areas and make players feel like they are actually interacting with the world. In this regard, I've come to really appreciate the dialogue choices that have become more frequent as the game has went on, as they at least make dialogue feel slightly more interactive, and despite not changing anything major, some are still used to really great effect, with one in particular at the end of Endwalker being a great example of how a small touch of player agency can add so much meaning to a particular scene, but these choices still aren't enough. Ultimately, a good story is always better when it's supported by good gameplay, which Final Fantasy XIV's main quest often fails at, and for some players in particular, this lack of gameplay might really detract from their enjoyment. The second major problem I think needs to be at least acknowledged is that the story sure can be a bit convoluted. There is now Aether, Dynamis, the Echo, the Blessing of Light, summoning, teleportation, tempering, sundering, reincarnation, time travel, memory
Well,
transfer,
WoW has the same
alternate
problem.
dimensions, and on
I mean,
and
there's a
on.
lot of factions and all these other
elements aren't just
groups,
lazily
and
thrown in for
I
a
don't
cheap
think
twist or overly convenient plot resolution. Usually, I'll always resent link pearls, but in some ways this can actually make these things even worse, as every little element is accompanied by scene after scene of exposition to try to explain it all, which can bring the story's pacing to a crawl. There's also a risk that with so many different elements involved, the writers will end up building a house of cards which will one day grow so tall that it collapses in on itself as different elements start to contradict each other, and there are times things already look a little shaky. But I think for now, most are willing to forgive this aspect to enjoy the story's better qualities. And one could have other issues with the story as well, like the overuse of certain narrative tropes, namely the fake character deaths and succeeding through the power of friendship. But how players will respond to these will be up to the individual. For the majority of the current player base, these flaws are worth overlooking to enjoy the narrative's positive qualities, and of those there is no shortage. There is something unique about Final Fantasy XIV's story in its vastness of scale and scope, and the way it has grown year after year, patch after patch, expansion after expansion. It is a true journey of epic proportions, where we witness the story of an entire continent that is interwoven with a large cast of recurring characters and an increasingly well-developed sense of history. The main story alone takes hundreds of hours of game time to complete, and it's worth pointing out that Final Fantasy XIV's story isn't limited to the main quest. There are in-depth storylines for every class, including crafters, every 24-man and 8-man raid, every optional trial, every new batch of relic weapons, and so on. Even if the quality does vary, the sheer amount of story content in Final Fantasy XIV is almost unrivaled, and if you're someone who loves this game, or its world or characters, the never-ending hours of story content is something you just can't get in many other games. And having witnessed this story grow since A Realm Reborn's release, and seen the player base's response to it, I've often wondered whether story might actually be more important to an MMO than people usually admit. This is a genre where people spend weeks, months, even years with these games, and their worlds, and so why wouldn't we want our time and experience to be given more meaning through narrative? To be invested in the story of a game has always made other parts of the experience better, and why should MMOs be any different? For years, people have read static, paragraph-long text dumps as the primary means of delivering story in MMOs, and no one would think this is acceptable in any other game.
I read it for a little bit, and
The
then I
same
was
is
like,
true for
no,
tedious quest
it's not
objectives that ask
engaging.
us to kill a few too many boars, or gather more sporadically dropping items than should realistically be needed. And the glacial pacing and viscous cutscene density of Final Fantasy XIV might just be another example of this. We put up with the bad because we want to care about this world, and its characters, and our character. We want our experience to have meaning because it isn't an experience like that of a normal game, something we pick up on a whim one day and are finished with by the end of a weekend. It is instead something that becomes a part of our lives, a journey measured in years, something we watch grow alongside our own growth, and a good story can only enhance every other part of the experience. I've seen several people declare Final Fantasy XIV's story to be the greatest ever told in a game, and I don't agree with that opinion, but I can understand why so many hold it. There is something special about this game's story, and if you haven't experienced it for yourself, you might not be able to understand this.
I don't.
In some ways, you just had to be there. And so, we have arrived at the second reason for why Final Fantasy XIV has become the biggest MMO in the world. Because it successfully utilised its story to create something that thousands of players have been able to fall in love with.
Well, they have way too many
which has
fanboys though,
grown and
right?
expanded as
Because they've
time
been
went
following
on.
it since
Whether that
the
is
80s or
unique
whenever
is up
Final
for
Fantasy
debate.
1 came out.
Other MMOs also have stories,
Or,
and other
I don't know.
MMOs might even have good stories.
Super Nintendo.
But one thing's for sure is that no other MMO has ever been this committed to telling its story. In Final Fantasy XIV, story really is king, and nearly all other aspects of game design have been made to kneel before it. For example, dungeons aren't just cool locations endgame groups of adventurers head to search for worthy foes and long-lost treasures. Since Heavensward, almost every dungeon is a moment in the main storyline. They are the game's main form of cinematic set-piece. They exist for the story. The same is true for most trials, which are the most epic raid boss fights in this game and are usually there to accompany the most epic story moments. The same is true for the world design, as where other MMOs might decide on which areas of the world to add next and then write a story to justify their inclusion, in Final Fantasy XIV, the story is what informs the world, and it is what decides where we go and when. And the same is true for the multiplayer aspects of the game, which are asked to fit into a story rarely willing to compromise or give them all that much real consideration. In Final Fantasy XIV, story is king, and I'm not sure most of the fanbase would have it any other way. And as broadly accessible as this game has been made to be with countless quality of life updates and casual and solo friendly design, the one thing that doesn't apply to is the story. It is the one part of the game that doesn't seem interested in holding the player's hand. In fact, almost no effort is made to ensure the player is keeping up. This is a story designed for those who read everything, and if that's not you, then tough. You will do it the Final Fantasy XIV way or suffer the consequences of always being confused how this thing works, or who that guy was, or what the last cutscene was actually on about. Still, there is one
I would imagine that
thing
affects
must be
most
said
players
about Final Fantasy
who
XIV
don't really
story,
follow the story and they
which is
kind of
that
just
outside of spending real money
sick of
in the
watching all these
out-of-game
cutscenes.
online store, the story can't actually be skipped, even the base game.
You know.
By comparison, every World of Warcraft expansion since Warlords of Draenor has come with a free level boost potion to take you instantly to the latest content, and this has become the norm for MMOs in the past decade, where no one is left behind and getting to max level is always made as easy as possible. But not in Final Fantasy XIV, as while the speed you gain experience points has been increased, a cutscene is still just as long no matter the player's level.
Yeah.
And so, if you want to get to the latest expansion or participate in
Yeah, skip all
endgame,
that crap.
you will have to play through hours and hours of non-stop story as you journey through all of the base game, every expansion.
Don't they make you
and
pay
every
for
single
like a skip
post-expansion
so you can
patch.
skip all the boring
It
cutscenes?
is a massive undertaking,
Right, and then just go to like the
this
newer
might
content.
be a problem for new players, particularly because the base game just isn't that good anymore.
Yeah.
What is the biggest mistake World of Warcraft ever made? I'm sure there are lots of varied answers to that question, and I'm not going to try to convince you mine is the objectively correct one, but I do want to share it with you anyway. Because, in my opinion, the greatest mistake WoW ever made was how each expansion was designed to invalidate older content.
Yeah.
It has been 18 years since World of Warcraft first released, and there is 18 years worth of content in that game, at least some of which is very good, but almost none of it is relevant to the game as it is today. I guess no one knew at the time that WoW would still be going fairly strong 18 years later, and you can't blame anyone involved for not thinking of an 18-year plan when the Burning Crusade first entered development. But with the
18-year
always helpful benefit of hindsight, you cannot convince me that the short-term oriented, only one expansion matters at a time design of that game was the right one.
Yeah, because at
World of
any
Warcraft
moment
has had plenty
it could
of
just
good
cut the
content over
cord.
the years,
And,
which should never have been treated as simply disposable. In this regard, Final Fantasy XIV has done something very clever, whether intentional or not, because while World of Warcraft is, at its core, an endgame, meaning PvP and raiding, oriented game, Final Fantasy XIV isn't. Its greatest focus is, and always has been, as was just discussed, the story. And with each expansion released, that story has only grown. It has been expanded bit by bit into something greater than what came before, and so the release of a new expansion isn't to the detriment of the rest of the game. And so, for those who enjoy the story, which is the majority of the player base, Final Fantasy XIV has become better and better, and will likely continue to do so in the future. This is the third of my reasons for this game's
content
success,
stays real.
and
Oh,
this
damn,
doesn't
it does.
just apply to the story either. A big part of Final Fantasy XIV's group content is roulettes. These are dungeons and easier difficulty raids that are divided into different categories, which the player can then queue for to play through one at random for a bonus reward. If you want to level a different class or gather endgame currencies, roulettes are one of the best ways to do so, both due to how enjoyable they can be thanks to their large and ever-expanding amount of variety, as well as how rewarding they can be thanks to the daily bonus. If there is a particular type of group content you don't want to do, you can always ignore that particular roulette, and so overall this content makes for a nice, relaxed endgame activity that you can also do alongside friends. But even more importantly, this also ensures new players doing old group content for the first time will still have people to complete it with, while also keeping older group content relevant no matter the expansion. This is clever game design that benefits the whole player base, and Final Fantasy XIV is ahead of many of its peers in this regard, as group content is not just forgotten or doomed to irrelevancy the moment it falls out of the current expansion spotlight. However, for both story and group content, it's hard to deny that A Realm Reborn, which is the base game and therefore the first thing new players will experience, is letting the team down a bit in both its story, group content, and overall leveling experience. The story's problems
It really
aren't
does
that
seem
drastic, and
overwhelming
it's
to
worth
dive
remembering
into
that it
this
did receive a
game
positive
now.
reception in most reviews when A Realm Reborn first released. Really, it just feels a little too generic, its characters too one-dimensional, and its pacing too slow. This is made worse by the fact that many new players, lured in by the promise of a good
Let me
story,
get that back.
will specifically be looking forward to playing through the later expansions, as this is when they hear it actually gets good, while MMO veterans are probably just looking forward to reaching endgame, as that's usually an MMO player's main objective while leveling. In this way, A Realm Reborn's average story becomes a barrier to players that gets in the way of better things still to come, which might make it seem even worse. As for A Realm Reborn's group content, its main problems have to do with scaling and difficulty, more so than the quality of the content itself. Over time, there are certain things Square Enix has improved at, such as designing unique and interesting boss mechanics, but in some ways, A Realm Reborn's group content still stands out as being some of the most immersive and non-linear in the entire game.
Oh, that looks
and the
gorgeous,
overall quality isn't that bad, particularly as the simpler mechanics make sense as a way to ease potential newcomers.
Hey, I know that level. That's in Neo 2.
However,
That's the
difficulty of this
that one
content in
level.
the current state of the game is incredibly lacking. With each expansion, old content has been made easier due to a range of factors, such as changes to skills and the impact of scaling down higher level players. The end result of this is that every fight in A Realm Reborn is far easier than it was on release, to the point where they can feel like parodies of their former selves, and A Realm Reborn wasn't a particularly difficult game to begin with. From a gameplay perspective, this makes this content boring for most players, particularly those who have played other MMOs before, but it also diminishes many story moments. I don't want to spend too long showing examples, but I do want to illustrate how bad the issue is, as I don't think many players realise just how drastic the difference is these days. So, let's look at two fights, one early into A Realm Reborn and one towards the end. The first is Ifrit, the earliest primal the player takes on and one of the most recognisable Final Fantasy icons. It starts with a still really cool cutscene, and at this early point in the game, this is by far the most interesting thing to have happened yet in the story. Then you get into the fight, and it's over in 1 minute and 20 seconds. During this, Ifrit doesn't get a chance to use his main AoE attack, Radiant Plume, because the fight ends too quickly, and this was in a group with 3 low-level sprouts, by the way, so this isn't even the effect of high-level players. By comparison, I don't know exactly how long the fight took on release as I can't find a full video of it, but I did find a video guide where they had over 1.5 bars of limit break when the nail spawns, whereas today you have less than 1/4 of a bar. And the fact that there used to be video guides created for this fight, I think, speaks for itself. Still, Ifrit normal mode was never an interesting fight, and this encounter is very low level. So let's look at something else. How about the final boss fight of A Realm Reborn's main story, Ultima Weapon? This fight now lasts 55 seconds.
What?
There is still healing to do, and AoEs to dodge, because all DPS players just ignore the actual mechanics to rush the boss down instead.
You don't even need a
One
tank?
thing you don't see anymore, however, is the boss's final attack, Ultima. The story behind this enemy is that it's an ancient superweapon designed to cast the ultimate magic, which is the spell Ultima,
Oh,
and
do the
that's
leap.
why it's so
Just
important
do
you defeat it here.
leap in the air from
And
Monster
this
Hunter,
used
right?
to be what happens in the final phase of this fight as a climactic DPS check. The boss trying to cast this spell is basically part of the story, and there are several lines of dialogue to go with this. But now the boss dies so quickly, it doesn't even enter into this final hit point percentage based phase. Even worse than this though, is that as this fight now lasts less than a minute, it means you only get 1 minute into the boss's theme song, which means you don't get to the best part. This is what it should sound like. This is what players are missing out on. Wait for it.
Yeah. That looks like how it was designed. You gotta pay attention, otherwise you get lasered or whatever. Let me see if I have the scene set up right.
This piece of music might be the single best thing in A Realm Reborn, and they've fucking ruined it. This part doesn't even come close
You won't
to
even
playing,
get to
by the
hear
way.
that by
You'd
the
have to
time it
fight
dies.
Ultima Weapon 3 times as it is right now, just to reach it. So, in terms of story, music, and gameplay, this fight has been destroyed. In video
Oh,
footage, I found this fight used to take 5 minutes and 30 seconds, by the way, and you could make similar comparisons for almost all older content. I feel I need to repeat my earlier point, but this content was never particularly challenging, and it was already at a good difficulty level for new players. This content did not need, nor could it afford, this reduction of difficulty, and this isn't just a Realm Reborn problem either. It affects all older content to some degree, including other important story moments like the final boss of Heavensward or Stormblood. I'm sure some max level players are listening to this right now thinking it's a good thing everything is so easy, because it means quicker roulettes, but roulettes could be changed to give
okay.
more
I
XP
think I have
or
the scene
theme
set up
songs
right.
if the time they take is an issue, and the quality of the content should always be the priority. This doesn't help new players either, as the complete lack of challenge just removes all incentive to actually learn to play your class or take boss mechanics seriously, while ensuring that when challenging content does finally appear, the spike in difficulty might be too sudden for people. It is an asset that older content is designed to stay relevant, but it can't be neglected in this way, and that's what's happened here. The lack of difficulty isn't a deliberate change, it is an unintended consequence of many other changes made as the game has evolved, but new players and the content itself deserve better. This isn't the only problem with low-level gameplay, however, as this content is also hurt by the lack of player abilities.
Sorry.
Due to the increased rate players gain XP, this isn't much of a problem for new players, at least for the earlier levels, as new abilities are unlocked frequently. However, by level 50, every class is left feeling rather basic.
I don't even know what the level cap
This
is.
makes things less interesting for new players, but the real problem is for max level players doing level scaled content, as they lose so many abilities when scaled down that every class feels bad to play. The reality is, classes have evolved over time with each new expansion, but at the same time every class was basically better to play at level 50 in A Realm Reborn than it is now in Endwalker when players are scaled down to level 50. For a quick comparison using Dragoon, in A Realm Reborn you also had the following skills: Heavy Thrust, Internal Release, Lobotomize, Leg Sweep, Impulse Drive, Power Surge, Ring of Thorns, and maybe also Fracture, if you were a Fracture using kind of guy. That's at least 7 less DPS related skills, in addition to the more advanced base rotation and the much more important positionals. And what have they got in return? True North and Arm's Length, skills which exist to allow you to do less. Dragoon wasn't particularly difficult or interesting to play in A Realm Reborn, but it was a lot better than it is now when scaled to 50, and this becomes even more apparent when you compare how classes were in Heavensward to how they are at the moment when scaled to 60, or in Stormblood to how they are
it might
now
be 60.
scaled to 70.
Oh,
The reason this has happened is because each expansion has added new skills for every class, but in order to prevent overall skill bloat, each expansion since Stormblood has also removed some skills. And while players may each have their own favourite ability that has been axed that we miss dearly to this day, Generally, the way the developers have went about this skill compression has been fairly intelligent, with those targeted often being unimportant, and with many skills simply being combined. However, this has still left lower levels feeling pretty empty, particularly for max level players who have grown used to having access to their full range of abilities. The simplest solution to this would be to just give players more skills earlier, so that by level 50 each class has most of their core spells and abilities. Basically, change it so that the skills each class has right now at level 60 are what they have at level 50, and then tweak the remaining skills currently gained from 60 to 80 to be gained earlier. This would mean players would unlock fewer skills as they level from 50 to 80, but so what? The small loss in sense of progression that comes from this would be more than made up for by the improvement to gameplay gained by giving players more abilities. And this would also make level scaled content much more enjoyable for max level players, as scaled down classes wouldn't feel quite so gutted. It's a win-win solution, and while this would mean low level content is made even easier, that just means it's finally time to stop neglecting this content in the first place and have a major re-evaluation of the current difficulty level. And finally, we come to the leveling experience. Originally, leveling to 50 was quite slow, and players had to engage with a wide range of content to not run out of sources of XP, including optional dungeons, the hunting log, fates, guild tests, and levy quests. Since then, the rate of XP gain for players has been greatly increased, so now you can level almost the entire way to max by just following the main questline. Increasing the rate of XP gain is logical as this game has plenty of content, so it doesn't need to be padded. However, this means there's no need to engage with other content anymore. If I were to ignore the quality of the story, the best leveling experience I've had in Final Fantasy XIV was leveling to 50 for the first time. This was because there was more variety to what I was doing than just reading dialogue and watching cutscenes, and because there was a much greater sense of interacting with the world around me. In particular,
I do miss the social aspect in MMOs, like telling people to look into group and pairing up and that kind of stuff.
Enemies. The log does provide a general location, but you still have to search this broader location yourself, which leads you to paying attention to the world around you, going to places you've probably never been, and seeing sights you may never actually see otherwise. It felt a bit like you were actually off exploring the world, and that sense of exploration is something that is very rarely felt in Final Fantasy XIV otherwise. You can still complete the hunting log, of course, but I wonder how many new players actually do, as there's no real XP incentive to it anymore.
Well, the
In
completionists,
preparation
they're
for this
gonna go
video,
for
I
it.
created a new character and went through the lower levels again, and in many ways the experience isn't bad. As you level fast, you gain new skills quickly, the Realm Reborn zones still look great, and the main questline isn't quite as slow-paced as it becomes in later expansions. However, one thing I did find was that I was very quickly over-leveled, even though I was mostly sticking to the main quest. This became particularly noticeable after the main quest sent you to the first 3 dungeons, Sestasha, Tamtara Deepcroft, and the Copperbell Mines, after which I found myself 10 whole levels ahead of the main questline, and that 10 level gap continued into the future. Being so over-leveled so quickly doesn't feel very good, as there's no longer any sense of reward to gaining XP, and it almost feels like you're being rushed through the world without the chance to engage with the things around you, like fates or side quests that you might at least want to check out. Still, leveling to 50 and following the 2.0 main questline isn't the real problem right now, as, at least for this section, there's still a good sense of progression, it doesn't take too long, you never run out of things to do, and you're always seeing new parts of the world. The problems really begin in the post-Realm Reborn, pre-Heavensward section from patch 2.1 onwards. Originally, there were major patches released every few months, and each came with new content, including new main story quests. In total, there was 103 of these quests, and playing through some of them every few months after each major patch wasn't that bad. But playing through all of them in one go after you've already completed the Realm Reborn questline and reached level 50 is a tedious slog. To remedy this, the developers reworked the entire Realm Reborn main questline to try to shorten it in patch 5.3. This removed a grand total of 45 quests, while shortening some of those left, with the post-Realm Reborn section being decreased from 103 to 80. This wasn't a bad effort to try to fix what by that point had become a well-known problem with the base game, but it still isn't enough. Cutting content is difficult, as some quests can't simply be removed without other quests making less sense, but after playing through most of the 2.x main questline, I still felt there was room for further streamlining.
I don't think
For
I could beat
example,
this
in the
guy.
patch 2.1 questline, you could remove the pointless trip to Mordona and instead go straight into the Moogle King quest.
I don't even know
In
how he's
patch
healing.
2.2, you
Evan's
could
Gate?
remove the first two quests that
Or
focus on the
Evan's
missing
Crate?
crystals and instead go straight to Eldar to meet Yugiri. Then
Damn.
remove the entire return visit to the Walking Sands where you look for hiding children and help out with the coach. Then when you move on to the Leviathan questline, there's a couple more steps that could be removed, and so on. You get the idea. I won't go through every patch. The point is, there is
Rob,
still
help.
room for shortening these sections. It just might require some minor text rewrites to allow the rest of the story to still make sense. However, if you really want to streamline the Realm Reborn main quest, the real space where fat is begging to be trimmed is in the 2.0 questline, which is for level 1 to 50 content, where you are still frequently sent on unimportant tasks that serve little purpose beyond giving the player busy work. These negatively impact the story by slowing its pace, and at this point, the best solution to the Realm Reborn problem might be to further reduce the main questline, particularly the 2.0 content, and then change the original main questline to take the player to level 45, with the 2.1 to 2.5 content being adjusted to take the player from 45 to 50. The 2.0 main questline already only has 5 quests higher than level 46, so this wouldn't require many changes to enemy levels outside of perhaps an adjustment to the 2 8-man main scenario instances, and it would give new players a much smoother and more natural leveling experience where they won't have to feel like they're always over-leveled early on, or that they are stuck in the endless level 50 post 2.0 slog that currently feels like it exists only to cockblock unexpected new players from reaching Heavensward, where everyone says the game actually gets good. Still, there is an overarching point I'm trying to make here, which is that A Realm Reborn can, and probably should, be improved. Fix the difficulty of group content, give players more skills sooner, and streamline the main questline. If I really had my way, I'd also include redoing the entire English voice acting for this section. The current voice acting is not good, and the actors all change at the start of Heavensward anyway, so just pay the cost and redo all of it. Because no matter what the future has in store for Final Fantasy XIV, the story will always be relevant, and there will always be new players stepping foot into Eorzea and judging the game based on their impression of A Realm Reborn. So make it better. Fix the Realm Reborn problem by simply improving it. Of course, there is another solution to the Realm Reborn problem, which is to make it skippable, either in its entirety or just the main story. But I think this is the wrong solution for several reasons. Firstly, Heavensward's story is good, but it begins in A Realm Reborn. Basically, patch 2.4 and onwards is focused entirely on Ishgard and the current state of Eorzean politics, and people who skip this would be at a complete loss as to what's going on at the start of Heavensward. This problem would then continue into the future, as there are countless references, callbacks, and direct continuations of plot elements raised in A Realm Reborn throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV's narrative. And this story can be confusing enough as it is, without players just skipping a big chunk of it in the first place. Secondly, A Realm Reborn does have some good qualities, and that includes the story. It is the only part of this grand narrative where the stakes are relatively low, and your character is not yet a famous hero. In many ways, it's your origin story, and it represents an integral part of your character's journey and growth. It also features a lot of lore and world building that, even if not strictly necessary, still enhances the rest of the experience. And so, A Realm Reborn lays an important foundation that each later expansion then builds on, and even if it doesn't do the best job at laying that foundation, that doesn't mean it's not needed. So, don't make the mistake of other MMOs. Don't prioritise the short term over the long. Don't throw away valuable content in an attempt to let new players catch up faster. A Realm Reborn does have its problems, but it's not beyond saving, and in the long term, such efforts might be worth it. And it's not like the problem of too many main story quests would just go away after A Realm Reborn anyway. Each expansion asks the player to take their time reading and watching the story, and then the stretch of post-expansion story quests slows leveling down even more. And that experience understandably won't be for everyone, but that experience is a large part of Final Fantasy XIV. With the benefit of hindsight, I do think the post-expansion story quests, those introduced after every expansion in patches 0.1 to 0.5, should have been designed to be much shorter, with more of the story they feature being told in optional supporting questlines, in order to allow players who come later to have a better catching up experience. Going through these patch questlines one at a time when they come out is very different from playing through all of them together at a time when you're just looking forward to the next expansion already. Still, it's too late for that now, and Final Fantasy XIV is the game it is. There is always a limit to how much of an experience can be changed to appeal to people who might have problems with it, and if you go too far, you risk changing the core appeal of the game itself, something other MMOs might have encountered in their hopeless quest to make their games appeal to everyone. Still, if you do get past the many hours of story content, there is one last side to Final Fantasy XIV that feels worth discussing. If there's one MMO-related saying I have always hated, it's that endgame is whatever you want it to be. This is something repeated by MMO players, journalists, developers,
Yeah, you
marketing
can't.
teams, and just about
There's
anyone
no
else who
such
ever
thing as
says
that.
those three little letters, and it's not actually helpful. I mean, sure, in theory, you can do whatever the hell you want in an MMO, just like in any other game or any other aspect of life. We all have free will and the potential to entertain ourselves in unexpected ways, but so what? All you're saying is that different things are theoretically possible in your game,
Yeah.
but different theoretical
Yep,
possibilities
that's
are a
without any
universal facet of
substance.
life, and all you're really doing by parroting this statement is avoiding a
Yeah, it's
very
like saying you could do
reasonable
whatever you
and
want in
probably
life.
earnestly asked question.
No
Next
shit.
time someone
It's
asks
like-
what the endgame is like, or what is there to do at endgame, just tell them. It's not some impossible to answer conundrum. What are the main things players do when they reach max level, and what are the main types of content being added to the game to support this? So, what is the endgame like in Final Fantasy XIV? Well, that's the great thing about this game. The endgame is whatever you want it to be. Nah, I'm just messing with you. Let me actually answer that question for once. If we consider that the main story and initial experience leveling is the not endgame part of the experience, then endgame is the various activities one might do after finishing the story. There is of course all sorts of different potential activities this can include, and this game does have a lot of content, but I think we can nevertheless still categorize them into three broad groups without being too reductive. These are leveling other classes or alts, acquiring collectible items including but not limited to outfits, minions, mounts, cards, songs and housing items, and finally there is also the classic endgame activity, improving your character's gear. So let's deal with each of these one at a time. Almost everyone who plays Final Fantasy XIV will spend at least some time leveling other classes. In the past there used to be a strong gameplay incentive to do this due to the cross-class skill system, which allowed players to use certain skills from one class on others, but this has now long since been removed, meaning there's no longer any actual reason you need to level any other class in this game. And yet, everyone still does anyway, and that's probably because in Final Fantasy XIV, unlike most MMOs, you can level all classes on a single character, and changing class is as simple as one quick button press. This removes much of the barrier of entry to leveling alts, as you no longer have to create a whole new character and go through the various busy work that comes with it, like rearranging your UI.
That's very interesting.
repopulating
I would
your
like to
friends
try
list,
that.
re-unlocking
I
travel
want to be able
locations,
to.
or
I mean,
redoing story
Final Fantasy
quests,
Tactics lets
and
you
many
do
other
that, though. Right?
inconveniences. Also, leveling other classes in Final Fantasy XIV is quick and
Job
easy,
classes.
as you get boosted XP if you already have one class higher level, and without so many story-related cutscenes in your way, the leveling speed feels fast. In fact, I know many people who level every single class in the game to max each expansion, which still seems excessive to me, but in this game it's relatively common. And with little reason not to level other classes, you might soon find that playing other jobs and roles can be quite fun. Final Fantasy XIV does have a bit of a problem with classes of a similar role feeling overly homogenized. This is something that's increased over time as more classes have been introduced and more changes have been made to ensure all classes feel balanced.
You have to
And
overlap.
to its credit, Final Fantasy XIV does have very strong class balance, and you can play whatever class you want in raids without seriously disadvantaging the average group. And don't listen to anyone who tries to tell you otherwise. If you think the difference in class strength in this game is bad, all you're really revealing is that you've no experience with other MMOs. And I remember when Stormblood first released, and every monk was crying about how hopelessly weak they are compared to the newly released Samurai, and how no one would ever use Monk again. And then the raid came out and the world first group used the Monk instead of a samurai, because hey, what do you know, I guess the difference was actually pretty small, you bunch of absolute babies. However, the downside to this higher degree of balance is homogenization and weak class identity. But even when what a class does feels very similar to what another class of the same role might do, the way each class does what it does is at least always quite varied, and there is something satisfying to learning a new set of skills and feeling the different pieces come together at max level. And playing multiple classes adds a lot to the gameplay variety by keeping group content fresh while giving you more flexibility when playing with friends, and it can even give you a greater understanding of the game or your specific role in groups by providing you with a greater sense of perspective. As for how you level other classes in this game, well, the main ways are repeated runs of level appropriate dungeons, the already previously mentioned daily roulettes, completing side quests including repeatable reputation-based beast tribe quests, completing fates, which are short, simple, scalable open world mini-events, and completing other unique group content such as Palace of the Dead or Bosnia. This provides a good amount of variety, although many people will find themselves preferring just one or two methods and mostly sticking with them. Still, it's always good to have different options, and while none of this content excels at providing truly memorable or unique experiences, it is fun enough to do as a side activity, particularly if you want some more relaxed gameplay. And if it does start to get boring, there's no reason why you need to keep at it. Leveling other classes is as optional as an activity can be. Second on our list of core endgame activities is acquiring collectibles, and there are a lot of things to collect in this game. How you collect them varies, but a lot of things can be bought, and costs tend to add up. Want a house? That's a lot of money. Or luck, the housing system isn't great in that regard. Want your house to look good? That's a lot of money. Want the latest revealing outfit to glamour your virtual wife?
Are these all like, you gotta pay
That's
real money
probably a lot of money.
to get credits?
Is it? I don't actually know. I've never felt the need to dress my character in the latest sexualized outfit, for reasons you can probably tell. Because my character already looks perfect just the way he is. Want every minion, mount, card, song, and other miscellaneous
Don't a lot of the
collectible?
characters play? Don't a
Then
lot of the
what
players pick
is
the
wrong with you?
the scantily clad bunny,
Everything.
the bunny
Get some
race?
priorities in your goddamn life, and also get some gil, because that stuff
I don't
is
know
a
what they're
lot of
called,
money.
but
Money really isn't
it's
that
very
important
common
in
to
Final
see.
Fantasy
You just
14,
flip into any
and
Final
the cost
Fantasy
required to
stream
raid in consumables
or
and
video.
repairs isn't very high, but optional things can be very expensive. This also connects to crafting and gathering, which can be a way to make money or just create your heart's desires, and sets itself apart from other MMOs in the way its focus is on self-sufficiency and how it involves genuinely complex rotations, which some people really enjoy. You might also need to run old group content or do other time-consuming endeavors to get items you're trying to collect. How much enjoyment people get from collecting this stuff is something I can't really say. I do know people sometimes take their glamours very seriously, but I don't. And
I like the
don't get
music
me wrong, I
playing
have been known
thing.
to make
How
some very
they can set up
fashionable outfits
bands
in my time, but
and play
mostly
songs
I
and
just
sync
don't
up with
care.
each other.
Actually, I usually just leave all my characters unglamoured in MMOs, as I kind of like just seeing their real gear, and I miss the days when that was the norm. I also don't care about mounts or minions or anything like that really, and while I did once have a house just to own one, I also never bothered to decorate it and ended up losing it through
Yeah, so
inactivity without
it might be
even
like
realising.
low
So
percentage,
it's
right?
probably
Only
fair to
like
say none of
5
this
to
stuff is for
10% of the
me,
player
and
base
I
is
am the
probably
wrong
going to care
person to
about
talk
and
about
buy
it.
and spend
I
money
can
on
say
that
the
kind of
glamour
stuff.
system surely isn't
customize
as
the
good as the
looks.
equivalent in World of Warcraft or Guild Wars 2 if you want an easy-to-use tool to play around creating different outfits with, and that the housing system, while fun for many landowners, is some kind of Kafkaesque nightmare for new prospective buyers. But really, how much enjoyment any or all collectibles provides in Final Fantasy XIV, and how this might compare to other MMOs, is a mystery to me. I still think it's worth acknowledging that this stuff exists, and to some it is important, but mostly I think it's worth acknowledging that you can very easily ignore this stuff if you, like me, have a character that already looks so perfect you don't need to waste time chasing material desires. Moving on, we get to a topic I am more qualified to talk about, gearing up, which happens for a few different ways that I will foolishly attempt to explain. Final Fantasy XIV uses an item level system, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically a numerical representation of a piece of equipment's overall strength. Generally, the higher the item level, the better, and Final Fantasy XIV's substats and itemization is
Lost
actually
Ark does
incredibly
it, yeah.
simplified, so item level is the only big thing you need to focus on. A character who has just reached max level can find some equipment upgrades through max level dungeons, of which there are 3 at the start of an expansion, with 1 more being added each patch. Currently, this dungeon loot would give you item level 560 accessories, and you get some item level 560 armor through the story, so getting to an overall item level of 560 is very quick and easy. From here, you can upgrade to item level 570 gear through a form of currency called tombstones. These are given to you for completing max level dungeons as well as doing roulette or any other max level group content, meaning this gear is also very easy to get, but it takes several dungeons worth of tombstones for a single item, so this isn't really quick. But if you want to just farm away at this, you can, and if you don't, you'll still naturally accumulate tombstones from most group content, so really item level 570 is just a matter of time. Next, we get to item level 580, and it's here where the experience gets a bit more interesting. There are currently 2 extreme 8-man trials, and 1 4-boss 8-man raid, which comes in a normal and savage difficulty. Normal is designed to be done by normal groups, meaning you can queue up for this content to run through it with a group of strangers, and you should be fine. You may see some wipes, but everyone should be able to regularly complete this content with a little bit of persistence. This rewards item level 580 items, although you can only get a few pieces per week. Meanwhile, the extreme trials give item level 580 weapons and accessories, and these are also the first really challenging fights you'll encounter. You won't be able to just queue up and power through these fights without knowing how to play your class and perform the boss mechanics for an encounter, but these are still very doable if you're willing to take the time to learn the fight and find a group of players through Party Finder. And with that, you potentially have a full set of item level 580 gear. Good job, I knew you could do it if you tried. Then we get to item level 590, which comes from a special type of tombstone currency which you can only get a certain amount of per week. Just like the normal tombstones, this is given to you for most max level content, making it very easy to get, but as there is a weekly cap, it will take quite a few weeks to get a full set of item level 590 gear this way. Still, this gear is accessible for all, even if you don't want to step foot in any raid. Finally, we come to item level 600, the final tier of gear, which comes from the Savage raid. This raid will be quite challenging, and if you want to clear all of it, you'll probably need to find a raid group to play with weekly, rather than relying on strangers. To get a full set of item level 600 gear, it will take several weeks of clearing the raid, but there are tokens from bosses you can trade for specific pieces, in addition to the normal loot drops for killing a boss, so it really won't take too long to get everything, provided you keep clearing the raid. And that is basically it, until the next big patch is released, which is always designed as a catch-up patch. In this there will be a new dungeon, a new extreme trial, and a new 24-man raid that is much easier than the Savage 8-man content, and so can be completed with strangers by queuing up. These all give gear below item level 600, but which can help you to clear the previous Savage raid easier. At this point you'll also get access to items used to upgrade the item level 590 weekly tombstone gear to 600 as well, and so even people who don't want to raid can still get the highest item level gear in time. Then when the next big patch comes along, there is a new 4 to 5 boss Savage raid released alongside the usual new dungeon and trial, and the cycle effectively repeats. And that's basically it. I have simplified a few bits like ignoring the relic weapon and crafted items, but this is most of it. The key point is that you don't need to raid. All this affects is how fast you gear up, and once the new Savage raid is released, gear is mostly reset anyway, meaning at every new raid it's easy to catch up with everyone else and be on equal footing. Also, nothing takes an overly long time to get, and luck plays a small role thanks to bosses dropping tokens. This means that loot isn't very exciting as it's all rather standardized and predictable, but this system does work well at meeting the game's objectives. It's easy to understand by MMO standards, it's accessible to all types of players including both more casual players and returning players, there's little frustration involved from needing to farm or having bad luck, and there is still a gradual sense of gear progression, so players can feel like they have something to work towards over a longer period of time. This fairly toned down gear treadmill becomes the objective of most max level group content, and so we could group all this content together as the final category of endgame. So, how is the actual quality of this content? Well, here it makes sense to break things down again, so let's start with the dungeons, or 4-man group content. First things first, there are no hard dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV. There used to be, I guess. Aurum Vale, the final leveling dungeon in A Realm Reborn, was quite tough back in the day. Not so much in terms of mechanical complexity, but everything did pack a punch, and wipes used to be very common. Still, these days there are no hard dungeons, and everything is designed at a rather standard level of difficulty, which new players will probably find enjoyable, and more experienced players will find a little easy. This isn't the end of the world, as dungeons don't have to be hard, particularly those designed for leveling players, and dungeon bosses in Final Fantasy XIV still have interesting mechanics, making them fairly entertaining to do. Generally, it's not that these fights are actually mechanically easy, it's just that their mechanics aren't very punishing. Usually, if you make a mistake, you take some damage and get a vulnerability debuff. If you keep making mistakes, these vulnerability debuffs quickly stack up, and you'll die, but you do get quite a few chances, and the opportunity to learn from your mistakes. This system works well as it means total group-wide failure is very rare, but that individuals still need to pay attention to perform the mechanics. That said, I do think it's a missed opportunity to not have any truly challenging dungeons in the game, as dungeons have a different feel and a different group size to the 8-man content, and I think many players might enjoy the occasional challenging dungeon. Over time, Final Fantasy XIV has developed a bit of a problem with how predictable its endgame group content is. Every 2-patch cycle is basically the same, with a couple dungeons, a couple trials, one 8-man raid and one 24-man raid, and the difficulty and structure of each type of content can also feel very similar. The longer you've played this game, the worse this problem can become, but what it basically means is that endgame lacks surprises and excitement, as you always know what's coming in the future, and nothing feels completely new. The developers have clearly found a progression system and content structure which works, and don't want to risk tampering with it too much, but challenging 4-man dungeons are the perfect example of a type of content that it makes sense to at least try out, even if it's not strictly needed, just to give more experienced players something that feels new to do at endgame. As for the design of dungeons, the visuals, and often the soundtracks, are very high quality, and are probably some of the best you'll find in an MMO, but dungeons still have a big problem in my opinion, which is that if you ignore the visuals, soundtrack, and boss mechanics, every dungeon since A Realm Reborn is basically the same dungeon. If you're not sure what I mean by that, consider this. Every dungeon has 3 bosses, no more, no less. Every dungeon has a few groups of trash mobs.
Oh, it's the same format
which
every
are arranged
time.
in a way so that you can always do 2 decent-sized pools. But every trash pool is also the same, as all of them you just AoE everything, with no need to worry about DPS order or crowd control or anything like that. Every dungeon is also the exact same shape, which is just a straight line, even if they sometimes try to pretend otherwise. Every dungeon also has the same simple loot. Every dungeon gives the same amount of currency relative
Oh, that
to
gets
the
old
least.
pretty fast
Every
then.
dungeon
I
takes
mean,
roughly
but
the same amount of time to complete. Every
it could
dungeon
still
is
be
in some
alright
ways
if
the
as long as the
exact
incentive is
same
there.
dungeon. If you've never played a game where this isn't the case, maybe you can't truly understand what I mean by this, but hopefully you can at least see where I'm
No,
coming
Neo
from.
2 follows the same thing,
The
the,
Final Fantasy
underworld.
XIV patented dungeon works, but the way it's repeated patch after patch, expansion
Diablo
after
4
expansion,
kind of also does
is
that.
boring, and
They
it's
try to
also hard to imagine.
recycle a lot of it.
Dungeons don't feel like real places we're exploring. They're not.
You'll
an
see, like,
adventure.
repeating
There are no
layouts.
surprises, and for me, there will never be a great dungeon experience in this game. That's not a deal breaker by any means. The dungeons are consistently fun, with none since the very low levels that ever feel truly bad. And there is much more to this game than dungeons. But there have been a grand total of 69 new dungeons released since 2.0, and it is a great shame in my opinion that
They're
Square
all the
Enix never
same.
felt the need to actually experiment a little with them and try to create something outside this
I
one
mean, that's
standard
just
template.
a sign of cost
Final Fantasy
saving.
XIV's dungeons are okay, but they could be much more. Next, we have the 24-man raids, and these are basically bigger dungeons, but better in every way. So, they're a bit harder, a bit less formulaic, a bit more rewarding, a bit more creative mechanically, and quite a lot more visually impressive. These raids provide some of the best looking content in the game, and unlike the next piece of content, they actually feel like real locations, with fights that are interconnected to give more of a set-piece feel to the overall encounter. The only problem with 24-man raids is that they are infrequent and unimportant. They exist to help players catch up, but if you already raid, you probably don't need to do any catching up, and just like with the dungeons, it likewise seems a shame that we've never had a truly challenging 24-man piece of content. I don't think the core progression of Final Fantasy XIV should move away from its 8-man focus, as this is what the raid scene in this game has come to be all about, and introducing 24-man progression into this would cause problems for existing groups. But I do think an occasional, optional, harder 24-man fight, say of a similar difficulty to an extreme trial, could enhance Final Fantasy XIV's endgame by, once more, giving players something which truly feels new and exciting. Finally though, we come to the 8-man raids and trials, and here is where Final Fantasy XIV's endgame shines brightest. This content isn't without its flaws, but overall Final Fantasy XIV's Savage Raids and Extreme Trials are some of the most fun group content I have ever done in an MMO. The raiding experience in this game is still quite different to that of World of Warcraft or other games which took inspiration from WoW, however. For starters, the group size of 8 is far smaller than the 20-man groups of other games, and this alone has a big impact, as in Final Fantasy XIV, the raid scene is built of static groups. This means every raid night the same 8 people turn up and play together, whereas in 20-man raiding, there should always be more than 20 people in your overall raid team, and positions won't be fixed. Which of these you prefer will mostly come down to preference and circumstances.
WoW used to do that, right? I think
example, in Final Fantasy,
when you're
you
doing
never
raids, you're
experience
locked. Well,
disappointment
I
of
think they
turning
still
up to a
do. When you're
raid,
locked into
only to
that,
find out
you're
that there are
locked
too
out.
many people
You
and it's
can't
your turn
really
to sit
do a
out
new
this
group
week.
or something.
But it also means if
A
one
weekly
person can't
reset.
make it to a raid, it will be a bit of a problem, and anyone with an unreliable work schedule is at a big disadvantage. A static team of less people also means more opportunities to get to know those you raid with, and it provides a more cozy and intimate
Yeah,
environment.
definitely.
But
Static.
it also means less meeting new people, and it's overall a bit less exciting. When it comes to the actual raid content, an 8-man fight can be designed so that every single person is fully involved. Everyone can have a defined role, everyone has to consistently perform mechanics, and you can't afford any dead weight. In an average 20-man group, you'll be lucky if there's no dead weight, and I killed plenty of heroic and even some mythic fights in WoW during progression without even having a full group. Sometimes you just don't have enough people online, and that doesn't have to stop you. But in Final Fantasy, it does. Everyone matters. And because they matter, the difficulty is made to feel more constant. From the start of a fight to the end, you always have things to do, and you always need to be paying attention. There are also differences between Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft beyond group size. Final Fantasy has less raid bosses per tier, but it also has longer encounter durations. Final Fantasy has more diverse mechanics in my opinion, but WoW often has more thematically logical mechanics. Final Fantasy has a smaller focus on loot, both in terms of how much it helps during progression and in how exciting it is to acquire, but it also has less loot-based RNG. Final Fantasy has more relaxed consumable requirements, less downtime between wipes, and no need to grind other items or currencies outside of raids to keep up with progression. Meanwhile, WoW has more fights at the highest difficulty, i.e. Mythic, whereas Final Fantasy is designed to ensure the hardest encounters, the ultimate fights, while fewer do at least stay relevant forever as a result of their unique rewards and the minimum item level system. Really, there are lots of differences, and you could go into this subject in much greater detail, if you really wanted. One of the most important and underappreciated differences is that in Final Fantasy you don't need any plugins to raid. Most people use a DPS meter, some use more than that, but you don't need any plugins, whereas in WoW, plugins play a huge role in the raid scene, and there is an expectation
I enjoyed
from
it, but I
most
also
players to have
didn't
them.
like getting all of it
This
every
is a
time.
big positive towards Final Fantasy,
Keeping
in my
all the
opinion,
plugins
as
up to
it makes
date.
raiding a bit simpler, a bit fairer, and there's no loss in satisfaction from an add-on playing a big part of the game for you. One of the hardest to explain differences is between how encounter design and mechanics feel in each game. Final Fantasy tends to feel much cleaner to me, whereas WoW always seemed somewhat more chaotic. It's a bit like the difference in DPS rotations, where Final Fantasy feels more methodical and WoW feels more frenetic. In Final Fantasy, fights really do feel like a precise dance that you're being asked to learn piece by piece, and all you have to do is take it one step at a time and execute things like you've practiced, and eventually you'll triumph. Meanwhile, in WoW, fights are less scripted and feel more like actual fights. They can be messy, a lot of things can happen at once, and there can be more variation between pools, and again, which you prefer will come down to preference. When it comes to what WoW does better than Final Fantasy, there is one thing that stands far above all others though, and that's how it creates raids which feel like real locations. In Final Fantasy, each raid boss is its own instance. You just teleport in and start when ready. There is no trash, no exploration, and no larger area to move through as you progress through the raid. What's more, every raid arena feels rather artificial. They can look quite impressive, but most are just floating circles or squares with some kind of weird elemental effect in the background, and after a while, this soon feels rather noticeable. These arenas really do feel like raid arenas created for a video game, rather than places that might actually exist within the game's world. This can be quite immersion breaking, and it makes the whole raid feel less alive and special. And while raiders might seem like the type of players who only care about the gameplay and rewards, and don't need anything else, I'm not sure that's actually true. Maybe people don't technically need trash mobs or diverse boss arenas, but that doesn't mean these factors don't enhance the experience. Just take something like Icecrown Citadel. Final Fantasy XIV may have villains as memorable as Arthas, and it certainly has some better designed encounters than the Lich King, but there is no Icecrown Citadel in Final Fantasy XIV. There's nothing that even comes close. A raid can be more than just a series of boss fights. It can be an actual place which holds meaning within the game's world and gives meaning to the player's actions within it. And considering how important raids are in terms of the time players spend with them and the memories they bestow, it is very disappointing to me that Final Fantasy XIV's raids really are just raids. Despite that, if I were to choose which game I preferred raiding in between Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft, I would always choose Final Fantasy XIV. This has long seemed a bit paradoxical in my mind, because on paper, if I were to write down all the differences between raiding in these two games and choose which one sounds better, I would always choose World of Warcraft. I mean, for things like 20 man vs 8, it's no contest, 20 wins all day. And yet, I'm not judging these two experiences on paper. I'm speaking from experience, and in practice, I enjoyed Final Fantasy quite a lot more. You might think this is a reflection of how much I enjoyed the rest of the game, or a result of the people I played with, but I don't think it is. I think I enjoyed raiding in Final Fantasy more because it was more consistently enjoyable. WoW provides more excitement, it has higher highs, and there are ways it clearly does raiding better, but also sometimes in WoW I was bored during progression, or felt like I didn't really matter. Whereas in Final Fantasy XIV, I found that encounters were always well designed and consistently challenging, and that just ended up being a better fit for me personally. And that's what I think it ultimately comes down to. Each game does different things well, and which someone will prefer will come down to personal preference. But honestly, that itself says a lot, and that's why I've focused so much on World of Warcraft in this section. Because there is no higher praise for an MMO than to be able to go toe-to-toe with World of Warcraft's raiding and walk away with it seeming like a fair contest. WoW was the undisputed raiding champion for years and years, and it's one of the main things that game has always focused on, and whether or not Final Fantasy XIV is actually better, it is at least capable of giving it some real competition, and there have not been many games ever able to do that. And so that, I guess, is Final Fantasy XIV's endgame. I mean, there is PvP, but it's not very good, and most people pretend it doesn't even exist. There is ERP, but I don't know if it's any good, and I like to pretend it doesn't exist. There is the Golden Saucer, which has several minigames, but these aren't particularly well developed on their own, so they mostly fall under collectibles, and so on. Endgame is whatever you want it to be, as everyone says, but in general, Endgame is leveling ults, attaining various collectible type items, and gearing up through dungeons and raids. And I'd say overall it's pretty good. Is there enough endgame activities in Final Fantasy XIV? Yes. Is there enough endgame activities for you personally? I don't know. Who are you? Honestly though, when it comes to MMO players in general, it doesn't matter what there is to do at endgame or how much content there might be. It is not enough because it is never enough. There will always be players out there who want more, those who would play every hour of every day of the year, devouring any and all content you put in front of them. And these people will never be satisfied, not in the long term anyway, and a game shouldn't be designed to cater for them. I'm sorry if this is you, and I hope you know that I don't judge you for your life choices. You have no idea how much I respect certain overly time-consuming MMO achievements, but regardless, it's still true that no endgame can last forever, and they probably shouldn't try to. And Final Fantasy XIV's certainly doesn't. It is very easy to walk away from this game and come back to it whenever the hell you feel like it. You don't have to worry about not being able to catch up. Most important content stays relevant, and the game steers away from overly demanding grinds or RNG-dependent progression systems. Game director and accidental cult leader Yoshi P has famously said that if a player runs out of things to do, then they should just take a break, play some other games, and come back later when they feel like it.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
And as someone who has stopped playing this game multiple times, I appreciate that. Forcing players into overly long grinds may keep them subscribed a little longer, but it doesn't keep them happy. And perhaps in this, more so than anything else, Final Fantasy XIV gets endgame right. You're never pressured to do things you don't want to do in this game, just to gain an advantage somewhere else. Its endgame is inclusive, for players of different types, with different amounts of time, and different tastes in content. And that is reason number 4. Still, none of these reasons mentioned so far are what I think is actually the most important for why Final Fantasy XIV has become so successful, and why it has done what other MMOs haven't. For that, we're going to have to talk about something everyone knows is important, but nobody seems to ever mention. When I returned to this game recently, I wasn't really feeling it. I'd been away for just over 2 years, which was enough time to lose some of my interest in the story, and it's always a little weird returning to an MMO because of how complicated their systems are, and because of how much there is to do in them, meaning you always feel a little lost initially. It's a bit like returning to work after a long period of absence, when nothing comes naturally anymore, and you miss your past familiarity that you once took for granted. Things quickly changed for me, however, when I was reminded of how good some of the boss themes are in this game, and then went on a several-hour-long YouTube binge of many pieces of old boss music.
I'll check out the
If the
soundtrack.
game
I haven't
is out
ever
there
heard the
with better
soundtrack
boss
before.
music in Final Fantasy XIV, then I don't know it. Probably because it doesn't actually exist. And this isn't just my opinion. I'm stating this as a fact. If anyone disputes this, feel free to head down to the comments and show me evidence to the contrary. And I mean that, bring your best, we can have a boss battle theme showdown. I'd even offer to stream it here on YouTube, but it seems I'm not actually allowed, because apparently murder is against the YouTube terms of service. Really though, Final Fantasy XIV has some of the greatest boss music you will ever hear. It does epic like few others. Here is an example from one of my favourite fights, Forden Extreme. It starts like this, just to set the stage a little. Then it builds with time. Then you get a little taste of the good stuff, but not too much. We've got a whole fight to get through here, remember? Just needs to be enough to make sure you're feeling it. And then it changes completely, with this more calming intermission for the ads phase, where it almost sounds like a separate song. But then this starts to build and build and build as you move towards the end of this phase and prepare for the boss's biggest attack. And then, after you survive that attack and move into the last phase, this starts playing as the final showdown begins. And could you ask for any better music to wipe to? And there are many themes this epic. What about Shinryu? What about Ultima? But okay, music is subjective and maybe you have bad taste and can't appreciate an epic boss fight.
Oh, that's really good.
But
I want to hear
don't
more
worry,
of it.
that's not all this game has. In fact, there is a staggering amount of diversity to the different music you'll hear in different boss
Dude,
encounters.
that's crazy though. They
Want
have the
some
full-on
J-pop?
orchestras for that.
We got you. Feeling a little edgy today and want something a bit heavier? No worries. Want something just unlike anything you've heard before? Well, we have that too. Or maybe you don't really care about genre and just want something catchy. Well, if you insist. You can tell how confident the developers are in their boss music when they make dancing to it a part of the mechanics. And the thing is, there are so many different examples I could choose here. I could drag this section on, and thanks to how good the music is, everyone watching probably won't even mind. I won't do that though, but I do at least want to mention how the music can also be a part of the story. For example, when the story is sad, you might get these quieter piano moments. When the fight is a good-spirited competition between great warriors, the music then reflects that. Or how about those times when the music from the trailer comes back just at the climax of the story, just before the final showdown, and then suddenly you realise that the trailer music that you've probably already played the hell out of, because you're the kind of loser who listens to video game music in your free time, don't try to deny that by the way, I know what kind of people watch my videos, then you realise that this trailer music that you already like wasn't just there to sound cool during some fancy CG cinematic used to promote the game. No, all this time, it actually existed just to describe this moment, and every line makes perfect sense now that you know the context. It was all for this instant, for this boss fight, and how the fuck can you not be hyped after something like that? Does life get better than this? You have your great story, your great boss fight, your great music, and I haven't even used any example from Endwalker, which arguably does crazy boss music setups even better, or mentioned any of the many remixes from other Final Fantasy games, or even the non-Final Fantasy stuff like the Final Fantasy infused mashups from Nier. What I'm saying is that this is not just a matter of opinion. In its widely varied and continuously rich totality, Final Fantasy XIV's boss themes are as good as it gets. All of this comes from sound director Masayoshi Soken, by the way, and you should make a note of that name, but is one that deserves to be remembered for a long time to come. Still, if you haven't played this game, you probably can't understand how great this music is. I mean, sure, you can hear these themes as pieces of music and maybe think they sound pretty good, but that's not actually why they're so special. What really makes them are the memories we associate with them. All I need to do is go to YouTube and start listening to any of these themes for a flood of happy memories to come rushing over me. Players spend time with these boss themes, potentially hours and hours, and those are hours they won't just spend alone, but with friends, working towards a challenging objective together, having a good time, enjoying the music, enjoying the gameplay, enjoying the company, creating memories. And memories are a huge part of MMOs, and I don't think anyone ever acknowledges to what extent they shape our experience with them. Everyone who is a fan of MMOs has a vault of happy memories locked away in their minds that they can't help but return to at times. We all remember the first MMO we lost ourselves within, or that one guild that was just so much more fun than any other we've been a part of, or that raid kill we never thought we'd finally manage to nail down, or that time we did something crazy in PvP but no one would believe actually happened if someone wasn't there to witness it with you. But what happens when things change? Try to play almost any MMO you used to like, and the experience will be different to what you remember. You are returning to a childhood home to find that life has moved on without you, and this isn't the place you grew up in anymore. And it's sad, because of the memories, because you remember what was lost, because the game you care about is gone, and everything you do in that game now is a reminder of that. Empty servers, offline friends, vacant cities, and forgotten guilds, but it's not just the people, it's the games themselves, with their new conveniences and missing features, and links to an in-game store that didn't even used to exist, and the old raid content no one does anymore, that used to mean everything, and now means nothing. And, even if by some strange miracle you aren't struck by that melancholic nostalgia, everyone else sure will be. You cannot play World of Warcraft without hearing people talk about how things used to be, about the good old days and what a travesty the game is now by comparison, and you will hear this again and again and again, and it's not a recent thing either. This is by no means unique to whatever the latest disappointment of an expansion was. World of Warcraft has been trapped by its own past since as long as I can remember, since before I even first played the game, and that is already over 10 years ago. But Final Fantasy XIV is the rare example of an MMO which isn't. Ever since the release of A Realm Reborn, this game has stayed true to its vision. The things this game used to be good at, its presentation, its story, its Final Fantasy themed fan service, its accessibility and new player friendliness, its inclusive endgame and its challenging group content, the game is just as good at today, if not better. And the things this game used to be bad at, the open world content, having immersive dungeons and raids, the gameplay and pacing of the main story, everything PvP related, etc. Well, they are still pretty bad today, but that's okay. No game is good at everything. What's important for an MMO is to find your own audience, and then stick with them. Cater to the people who actually like your game, and if you stand by them, you might just find they'll stand by you too, even when there are bumps along the way. And this game, as it is right now, proves that. World of Warcraft never had it easy. It was always torn between two different eras, of old MMO design and new, group finder or shouting for a party in chat, server communities or cross-server grouping and sharding, finding things out by talking to other people versus looking everything up online, content that asks you to dedicate hours to it versus content designed for people with jobs and families, and countless other examples. But Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO designed for a modern player base through and through, for better or worse. And if this game was for you when it came out, then it probably still is today, and tomorrow, and every day after that, and if it's not, it's probably you that has changed since, not it. The Final Fantasy XIV player base doesn't have that baggage that other MMO players seem to be defined by. They haven't been scarred by their own game, they don't obsess over that which was lost. And so, instead of that non-stop looking back to the past, in Final Fantasy, players actually look to the future. Where will the story go next? What are the next classes that will be added? Who's going to be the next Scion? Innocent questions, earnestly asked, with not a care given to what might be lost along the way. The future is bright here. The best always seems to be yet to come, and people are happy. They love their game, they love their game's director, and they have pride in their community. And maybe they can go a little too far in these regards, but that's okay, you can hardly blame them. It is a rare thing for an MMO player base to actually be content, and that positivity can be infectious. You will feel it within the game today, and God, what a sight that is to see in a genre as marked by disappointment as this one. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that is remarkable, not because of its lack of flaws, but because of its great success despite them. It is a game that truly did things its own way, and still does. And it is proof that the MMO genre is not dead yet, and won't be anytime soon. Most of all though, it is a game built on happy memories that are not just relics of the past. Final Fantasy XIV is a childhood home you can actually return to. And it's not over yet. Thank you for watching my video.
Holy shit. I want to hear the soundtrack now. Yeah, that conclusion was so good. The way he wrote the script on the conclusion message, like how he closes with like they get it.
Probably
they know their
because
fan
it
base
doesn't actually exist.
and they treat him well.
In fact, there is a staggering amount of diversity.
And then the other part, the other part that stuck with me was the message that, like, if you run out of things to do, I think you need to take a break, man. You're just playing. It's like, because they know the scale of it. It was like, oh, jeez. That's nuts.
When the time comes to strike, an emperor strikes without hesitation. Entertain doubt is to
I want to see more of his videos, man. This guy's amazing. His editing and his prose, vernacular, and the way he enunciates things.
The Final Fantasy infused mashups from Nier, features and links to an in-game store that didn't even used to exist, and the old raid content no one does anymore that used to mean everything and now means nothing.
Yeah.
Not a care given to what. Most of all though, it is a game built on happy memories that are not just relics of the past. Final Fantasy XIV is a childhood. Thank you for watching my video.
I'll take a look at his Final Fantasy retrospective. I haven't seen. Oh god, it's 5 hours though. Well, I could just start it, but I'm not gonna. I probably won't finish it. After I finish, I don't even feel like playing Final Path of Exile anymore. I want to finish this Ascendancy, and then I'll probably just log off.
Final Fantasy is many different things to many different people. With 16 widely varied mainline games, this alone makes it one of the longest running, highest selling, most critically acclaimed, and most heavily discussed video game series of all time.
Yeah.
And Final Fantasy is not just 16 games. With countless spin-offs, sequels, and other multimedia entities, the world of Final Fantasy is vast. It is a true behemoth of the gaming landscape, and it has been for quite a few years now. Yet, amidst so many games, so much history, and so many memories, I think it's easy to overlook just how much this series has achieved, and how much it's changed. Final Fantasy has come a long way, and that, more than anything else, is what I want to talk about. These 16 games say a lot about how video games have evolved, how the gaming industry has changed, how the Japanese role-playing genre was shaped, how it flourished, and how it declined. And I love this series. The flaws of these games are abundant, and sometimes surprisingly consistent. But within them are so many highs, so much innovation, and so much originality that I do wholeheartedly believe that not only is Final Fantasy worthy of being considered as one of the greatest series in gaming, but that it might even be deserving of more praise than it already receives. This video is an entire series retrospective, covering all 16 mainline entries. I have played most of these games multiple times. Some of them I have played 4 or 5 times. One of these games I have played for somewhat more than that, but most importantly, I have recently played each of these games consecutively over the last 2 months. And while a lot of people have talked about this series already, I don't think many people have ever played all of these games back to back over such a short time frame. So it may come as no surprise then that I have a lot to say about Final Fantasy, particularly how the series has changed, what each game manages to accomplish, and what was lost or sacrificed along the long and still ongoing 36-year journey this series spans. This video will mostly avoid spoilers, but there is some discussion of plot points, so if you want a completely unspoiled and blind experience for any of these games, you may want to skip over those parts of the videos. Also, I do occasionally get noticeably vague about certain plot points, but that's because I'm trying to avoid spoiling things.
You are relentless.
Anyway, on to the 80s. There is an oft-told story about how Final Fantasy was created that frames it as a last-ditch effort of a struggling company who put all their hopes, dreams, and remaining money on this one final game. Hence the name. Unfortunately, as poetic as this telling of events might be, it's not entirely truthful. Square was a Japanese software developer established in 1983 who created a number of early PC and Famicom titles spanning a diverse range of genres. One of the company's early hires was a young programmer and university student by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi,
Oh shit.
whose work and work ethics
Legend.
impressed those in the company, leading him to become one of their 4 project leads in 1986. The same year than a certain landmark RPG from developer Enix first released. Dragon Quest took inspiration from a number of PC games, particularly the Western RPG series Wizardry and Ultima, to create a more accessible and console-focused take on the genre. In doing so, Dragon Quest helped to create the Japanese console role-playing genre, more commonly referred to as the JRPG. As a result of its daring and innovation, Dragon Quest saw slow initial sales from an audience unsure what to make of this new type of game. But in time, its sales picked up, and then exploded, with 1.5 million copies being sold in Japan alone, making it one of the highest-selling Famicom games not published by Nintendo. Meanwhile, Sakaguchi, who was also a fan of Wizardry and Ultima, used the success of Dragon Quest to persuade Square to greenlight an RPG of their own that he would take the lead on. Despite this, Square remained skeptical of the project and limited its development team to initially just 5 people. And yet for Sakaguchi, this was finally an opportunity to work on the genre he most wanted to, where he could focus on the aspect of game design he was most passionate about: storytelling. And 1 year later, in December of 1987, Final Fantasy was released. For Sakaguchi, this may well have been his final game, as he made preparations to quit game development and return to university in the event that the game was a failure. But this wasn't how the series came to be named. In fact, the original title was meant to be Fighting Fantasy, which was only changed due to copyright concerns, with Final being chosen as a replacement, primarily because Sakaguchi wanted to maintain the abbreviated name of FF. Meanwhile, for Square, the success of Final Fantasy would forever change the company's trajectory, and they were experiencing severe financial difficulties at the time of its release. Yet whether Final Fantasy ever had the potential to be Square's final game remains unclear, and it wasn't their only commercial success of the year. Still, in the end, Final Fantasy was far from a failure.
Yeah, there were many times where they were just like, this is the last one. This is it. There's no more like.
Final Fantasy begins with a short text crawl explaining that the world is in peril and that a prophecy has foretold of the arrival of 4 warriors. This leads directly into character creation, where you create your party of 4. Once the game begins in earnest, you find yourself in the town of Corneria, where you're soon tasked with rescuing a princess from the Night Garland at the Temple of Fiends to the north. This is only the beginning of your grand adventure, but it is indicative of the level of storytelling found in Final Fantasy's first entry. The game's various NPCs do provide a little more detail and help explain the problems each town is experiencing. Yet the primary purpose of an NPC in Final Fantasy I is not to enhance the narrative, but rather to provide the player with hints and reminders of where to go and what to do. For a console game of this era, this still presented more story than most games had. But the main reason for this narrative brevity was mostly the data limitations of NES games at the time, which limited the amount of text that could be stored on a game's cartridge. This was one of the largest problems early JRPGs faced, and was a major contributor to the streamlined approach pioneered by Dragon Quest that ended up setting Japanese RPGs on a different path from their Western inspirations. Final Fantasy I was a more complicated game than the first Dragon Quest, however, with a significantly longer runtime, party members and multiple enemies instead of 1v1 fights, and more spells, equipment, and items. As a result of this complexity, combined with the NES's technical limitations, Final Fantasy I put a lot of important information in its manual. Manuals were important to many older games, in a way that younger generations may not realize. Forget floppy disks and VHS tapes, kids don't really need to know what they were, but the same cannot be said about manuals, as they were often a part of the intended experience and provided incredibly helpful information, as Final Fantasy I demonstrates. This manual is over 80 pages long, and provides a complete tutorial of all the game's important mechanics, from creating your party, to fighting enemies, saving the game, navigating menus, and much more. Still, it also provides crucial tips that even experienced JRPG players might overlook, like buy potions and run away from dangerous encounters, as well as a complete world map, an enemy chart including enemy stats, weaknesses and special attacks, explanations of what each spell does, something not told to players in-game, statistics for each piece of equipment, something else not displayed in-game, dungeon maps for the game's first 4 dungeons, and finally, a complete walkthrough for the entire first half of the game, right up to getting the airship. This is a lot of information, perhaps even too much, as this is the manual created for the American release, which is noticeably twice the length of the Japanese one, and really went above and beyond with providing players with as much helpful information as possible. This is because in the late 80s, console players weren't used to games like this, or games with an equivalent amount of complexity, and Final Fantasy I clearly wanted to be an accessible experience that could be enjoyed by players new to the RPG genre. And for the most part, it succeeded, even if its over-reliance on its manual is far from ideal. I feel a little bad for any 80s or early 90s kids who lost some of these inserts, or maybe borrowed this game from a friend and had to play it without knowing things like what each spell does, or how much attack each weapon has. Still, for as much as Final Fantasy I wants to be accessible and tries to help players, make no mistake, this is not an easy game. Combat in Final Fantasy I is turn-based, with random encounters found on the overworld and in dungeons. And right outside the very first town, you can run into monsters who can one-shot your party members. Also, monsters in this game like to travel in packs, have a fondness for inflicting status effects, and sometimes ambush you. This combination can be particularly deadly, and the world of Final Fantasy I feels dangerous, far more so than in later games in the series. This is mostly because you can only save the game at an inn, or with an expensive tent on the overworld. Healing is also limited as spells have limited charges, and for much of the game, you won't have enough money to buy all the spells and equipment you want, limiting your supply of gold and, by extension, restorative items. This means that with every step you take further away from the safety of the inn, danger increases, healing and hit points diminish, and the tension gradually ramps up as dying becomes more and more likely, at the same time that the loss of progress from death becomes more and more costly. One of the most important lessons players can learn in this game is knowing when to turn around so you can make it back safely to the inn before disaster.
An
The other vital lesson players must learn is the importance of the run option. Some combat encounters are too dangerous, or simply take too many resources to overcome, meaning fleeing is the best option. This goes against the convention of modern game design, where the option to flee exists for the player's convenience, and enemy encounters are deliberately designed to be an appropriate and beatable difficulty. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy I, encounter difficulty is more varied, and some combinations are meant to be overly difficult, with fleeing existing to provide a necessary strategic option. And when you've gained the wisdom to know when to turn back, and the humility to know to run, then, and only then, are you ready for Marsh Cave, aka the hardest dungeon in the game, and one of the hardest in the entire 16-game series. Marsh Cave is the first dungeon in the game, if that wasn't clear, and while it takes a while to get here, this is where the difficulty of the game peaks. Final Fantasy I basically has an inverse difficulty curve, where you struggle a lot and feel weak early on, and then grow in power at a faster rate.
I think I've played games like that before. I can't think of one that I remember though.
This can be quite satisfying, provided you make it through Marsh Cave, aka the hardest dungeon in the game. There are people who will tell you that Final Fantasy I is a game where you are meant to grind, and these people are wrong, but they aren't entirely correct either. Final Fantasy I is a game where you can, and many people do, grind. This allows you to bypass much of the risk inherent in the game's rather punishing design by killing monsters in the relative safety that comes with staying close to a town, where you're never far from the ability to save and heal, and then only heading to the next dungeon when you feel sufficiently prepared and powerful. Still, there is an alternative to this, which feels more like the way the game is intended to be played, where you head off to your objective, whatever that may be, and then turn back when you first start to run low on resources. In doing this, you'll still gain experience points, like when grinding, while also learning the ins and outs of dungeons, memorizing the floor layouts, picking up treasure from side paths, and gaining familiarity with the enemies you encounter, so you know things like when to run, or when to use your limited AoE spells. For a ball-bustingly difficult dungeon, like Marsh Cave, where your resources are
this character
limited,
sucks.
and you can't even
I built it pretty bad. I think
you'll probably have
I could
to
redeem
run
it.
back
I just
many
need
times
to
before clearing the
rethink
dungeon,
on
and the risk is so
some a
high
new skill.
that you may just be better
Cobra
off
Lash
killing
is
enemies
not
outside
that
of town,
great.
at least to get you started. For the remaining dungeons in the game though, grinding near a town usually feels like a slower, less efficient, and less enjoyable way to play. Attempting dungeons without grinding allows your limited resources to act as a natural difficulty check, where
I'll come back
if you're strong
later.
enough, you'll make quick progress, and if you're not, the repeated trips back to town will lead you to naturally acquiring more golden experience points until you are. This structure of reaching a town, struggling to overcome the next dungeon, before eventually beating it, leading to the next town and the next dungeon, where there's better equipment and more powerful enemies, shows the heart of what
I'm gonna go
Final
get some
Fantasy
food
I
or
is really
something.
like,
I don't know.
and reveals
I'm
an
ending
important
stream.
fact that isn't often acknowledged, which is that Final Fantasy I
Not feeling it.
basically a
Not feeling
dungeon
Path of
crawler.
Exile right at the moment.
It might not resemble more
Try something
modern
else some other
examples,
time.
and it doesn't take
And
long for the Final
it's not like
Fantasy
anyone else
series
is
to lead the
watching
way
anyway.
for
I
this.
think.
But
Let's see.
dungeons are the
Yeah,
main
no one's
focus of
watching.
this
I don't
game.
really give a shit anymore.
They are where you spend
I apologize
the
if I
vast
care
majority
less
of
and
your
less.
time. They are why there is
But
such a
I've
large
gotten no
emphasis on
engagement
resource
for the
management,
past 3
and
streams,
they are why this game
and
is still enjoyable
there's no point in me
36 years later.
pulling 10, 12-hour streams for when no one's watching anymore.
Still enjoyable.
So
Unlike
fuck
so
it.
many
I'm out of here.
JRPGs, including
I need
most
some
of
kind of
Final Fantasy
feedback or
series,
something
and especially
to know that
single-text entries,
I'm actually
in Final
making a
Fantasy I,
difference.
normal combat
'Cause I'm
encounters
not really enjoying games
are
anymore. I'm just
strategically
kind of
engaging.
playing it for
This is
like
largely
community
because you can't
and
just spam
catching
auto
up,
attacks to overcome every
and
basic
maybe a
encounter.
little bit of enjoyment
Final
here
Fantasy
and
I
there, but I can only
lands
enjoy it like
on
1 hour at a
targeting.
time.
This means
If
that
it's
you
like,
tell all your
you know,
party members
me
to
being
attack one
solo.
enemy.
Yep. That's gonna do it. Peace. Bye. See you next time. Signing off.